Good timing. So, so for Sharon's benefit, we're in N03. That's the link you should be following. We put it into the chat. This is the section called Fugitive Images. Last week, we did part 1, Epochs and Regimes, and we covered that pretty well. And this week, and probably for some weeks to come, we're going to be in part 2, Introduction to the Issues. And so what I was mentioning before is he kind of opens with 4 introductions before he gets down to the business of walking us through the different epochs in detail. And this is what you guys see before you as Introduction to the Issues under N03. This is his 4th intro. And this one, in some ways, is his best intro. Because even though the second intro is very useful in kind of giving us a top level view of the different epochs and what he's going to say about them, this one, he talks about why. This is the part where he talks about what's really at stake. Why is this an important subject? And I think for a lot of people, it can be very moving and maybe even shocking to think about some of these things, because he's basically asserting the truth, but a truth that as moderns we rarely think about, which is that just like human beings are mortal organisms, that we are born, we flourish, and we die, the same is true of epochs and civilizations. And
I'm glad we didn't skip over this. I'm very happy.
Yeah, this is the good stuff.
Yes, I thought so too.
I'll share my screen for a sec, Phil, just so you can see where we are.
So, yeah, but it doesn't do me any good if I can't read it first.
So if you've got the link, I put the link in the chat to N03.
Why?
And you can click on it.
I'm not sure if I found N03. Let me see. Let me see if I could get to it. But I don't see that. Exit full screen. Let me
go to chat. At 11:06, I posted meet everyone, https kennethsmithphilosophy.com.
N03. Okay.
N03.
And then what chapter? Not Fugitive Images.
Yes.
That's 3. 3?
Yes, Fugitive Images.
3.
So
okay.
So at first, last week we covered part 1 in here, Epochs and Regimes, under Fugitive Images. And this week, just scroll down a little further, and you'll see Introduction to the Issues, part 2.
Well, I don't have it, so I'll just have to wing it. Let's see.
Well, I'll just leave it up on screen for a bit then until people can find it, because it's fine.
What the hell is going on here? N03. All right.
So this is one of my very favorite quotes of all of the things that Kenneth Smith has ever quoted. Paul Valéry was a French essayist writing after World War I. He wrote at other times and around there too, but the power of his writing achieves a remarkable power during the period where he's writing after World War I. He's giving magnificent voice to the existential crisis that people had, about the fact that the entire world was swept up in a war that, as far as everybody could tell, never should have happened. The reasons for it to happen didn't make sense to people. And it's one of the wars that's famous for using outdated techniques against modern technology. So the body count was incredibly high. And it felt like an entire generation of people were just slaughtered for no reason. This is how people were feeling, around 1918, 1919. And you can see this is written in 1919. He writes this book, Crisis of the Mind, which is a collection of his essays. Stephen, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah. I was just going to point out, this is an interesting one, the effect of World War I and the crisis there. For example, you hear all this crap about climate change and stuff like that, and people are always bringing up this example that the British were growing grapes back in Roman times. And I researched it. Grapes were grown in Britain ever since the Romans showed up, and possibly before. But the interesting time when Britain was hardly producing any wine. There was only one period of history that was post-World War I history, because most of the grape growers had been killed in the Great War, and it made a comeback after World War II. So the only period when there was a real downer on wine was that interwar period.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, the Roaring 20s have a lot to do with people wanting to forget, just really being fed up. And it was, he calls his collection The Crisis of the Mind, but really it was a civilizational crisis, because the notions of progress and science, of enlightenment, the notion of a great march of progress that leads from the primitive to the advanced, from the warlike and savage to the peaceful and glorious. This was what was in people's minds coming out of the 19th century and going into the 20th century. And World War I seemed to just deflate all of that and left them really with a collapse of faith in the prospect of the entire modern epoch. All of us who've grown up since then, we can't imagine the level of optimism that people had before this happened. The sense of possibilities that people could do anything, could become anything. That pure promise of modernism. We've grown up in a more cynical era because so many terrible things have happened since then. But they really, a lot of them really believed that this was going to work. There were people writing utopias left and right, and science fiction left and right, speculating about the glorious future. And the war just shattered them. It was a difficult to comprehend level of collapse. But Paul Valéry, because he was well educated and because he was eloquent, was able to give voice to that in a way that most people couldn't, and to say the things that people were feeling. Stephen, you got your hand up again? Go ahead.
I pick up on this era so much. You get songs which pick it up, like Those Were the Days, My Friend, which is originally a Russian song about the pit just prior to World War I. But this is stupid. This wasn't to be unexpected. The warning was already there. It was called the French Revolution, the Enlightenment. All the little enlightened characters got in their little meeting rooms and all figured if we could only get rid of the monarchy and we could get at the controls of the aircraft, we'd create the perfect world.
Exactly.
They had the French Revolution. They talked about the evils of the witchcraft trials.
Yes.
But in 9 months, the revolution killed more people than the church had done in 300 years in witchcraft trials.
Yeah.
Now, Metternich is interesting that Metternich believed this was a great evil and he was going to do everything in his power to maintain a stable Europe. He believed strongly that mixture of the church and state and a very ordered society was something to be maintained. Who knows, he might have succeeded. We had Britain became the great power after the Napoleonic Wars.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a relative century of stability. It's quite amazing. There wasn't too many hiccups. Perhaps the American Civil War was one of the great hiccups in all that. But that period is progressive as one without equal in history. But then it came, the guns of August, it came to an end. The lights are going out all over Europe. And we probably won't see them come back on in our lifetime.
Yes. This is what people were feeling. This is what people were feeling. And it's at moments like that you can really get some deep insight into the nature of an epoch. Later, people like ourselves who occur later in an epoch, we've become good at covering up, even from ourselves, what our idealism is that still drives us. Because we clothe our idealism in cynicism and sarcasm and worldliness, and we distance ourselves from it, but it's still in there churning like an engine, even though we pretend that it's not. When people grow up during the later part of an epoch, they have very complicated relationships to the promise of their era, in which they don't want to believe that they've fallen for the propaganda. But in fact, the propaganda is still motivating them and still shaping the way that they think and process the world. They just now clothe it with a sense of being wearier and more, we believe the wool can't be pulled over our eyes as easily as it was pulled over the eyes of the people before the Great War. But the truth is, we pull it over our eyes just in a more cynical, in a more self-denying way. It's hard to explain. And so before you can understand late stage of an epoch, whether it's the late medieval, the late classical, or the late modern, you kind of need to go find one of these inflection points earlier in the epoch when people more purely had the faith. It's why if you want to understand the medieval epoch, it's so useful to read the speeches from the First Crusade, from the beginning of the First Crusade. What did they think they were doing? What was their dream? And only later should you be looking at what are people saying right before the Reformation, because right before the Reformation, they've tangled it all up in far more complex rationalizations. So it's part of why this is beautiful. This is basically the most beautiful statement I've ever read about the mortality of civilizations and about our simultaneous recognition of it and denial of it. We have this feeling like our civilization could go on forever at the same time that we have this understanding that no civilization ever does go on forever. We hold a contradiction in our heads, not a paradox, just a straight up contradiction. And we handle it by compartmentalizing the two and switching back and forth between them. And by putting them both on the page at the same time, Valerie has really forced us to look at something uncomfortable about our relationship to our epoch. We simultaneously are and are not true believers. When Kenneth Smith talks about modernism as being one of its distinctive characteristics is that rather than having a core set of values that we're all struggling towards, that instead our values come from shards of earlier epochs that are floating about in a nihilist relativist matrix, and that we modulate back and forth rapidly between kind of this world-weary nihilism on the one hand and this pure idealism on the other, and don't even notice our own minds doing it because we've become so good at it. We're so fast and fluent at shifting between these shards and sort of constructing a house of cards value system is one of the ways that Kenneth Smith would talk about it. So it's hard for us to understand what makes us tick because it's so complicated. So anyway, so why does he open with it? Sharon, go ahead. You got your hand up. Oh, you got to come off mute though.
Yes, I was trying. When I was reading this, I thought that second paragraph of Paul Valery kind of dovetails into what you just said, where he talks about Elam, Nineveh, Babylon were beautiful, vague names. And then he goes on to say, but France, England, Russia, and Lusitania. In other words, he's making the parallel or the comparison that though France, England, and Russia can have the same fate as Nineveh, Babylon, and Elam. And probably the best sentence of that whole paragraph is where he says, we are aware that a civilization has the same fragility as a life. Mm. And I thought when we were reading and we read back to the ancients and they set up the way they were running their lives on the physiocratic method. Mm-hmm. I kind of wondered if there was a parallel to that sentence.
Yes, because the Greeks were well aware of their mortality, and they were aware of the mortality of their civilization. They talked about it all the time. They thought about it all the time. They put up statues and altars everywhere, all around them, all the time to constantly remind themselves. If you've read Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, there's a character in Julius Caesar who's constantly following Caesar around and whispering in his ear to remind him that he's mortal, because they said it was so crucial to the ancient worldview to understand a human being not as a free-floating immortal spirit, but as an organism, as somebody who's born and flourishes and dies, and that mortality is what could drive us to do good things, recognizing that we shouldn't waste our time. We've only got so much time to make an impact in the world. For them, it was central. For them, thinking about the mortality of an individual or civilization was a critical issue. It's part of what makes classical Greece a special period, because they're making all of their children read the Iliad and the Odyssey. They want them to understand that the predecessors of the Greeks destroyed their own civilization and caused a dark age. They want every kid to know that and to be thinking about the death of civilizations. And they want them to be watching tragedies at the various, every 4-year cycle games, not just the Olympian games, but the others, the Nemean and so forth. Because they want every child, they want every adult to be thinking about the ways in which even people of goodwill, even people of virtue can create catastrophe and tragedy like their ancestors did in the Iliad. They want them to be thinking about that, so that when they vote, when they debate and vote, that they'll be thinking about what do we have to do to try to extend the lifespan of our city-state. And Kenneth Smith, I think, drawing off of earlier classicists like Gilbert Murray and others, he argues that the reason the Greeks wrote so much, and the reason they wrote so, as Nietzsche put it, the reason they wrote so, in some ways, starkly about themselves, unflattering in many cases, is because they had the sense of the clock running out on their own civilization. They felt like they had only so long to make their point as a civilization. And if they didn't put it into writing, then who was ever going to know afterwards what it was that they had tried to do? There's a passage in Thucydides, the Peloponnesian War, where Thucydides himself is leading a battle. And it's fascinating to read, because he says it was a blunder. Thucydides, he almost writes in the third person at that moment and says, Thucydides really screwed up this battle and we lost it. And you think, how many modern writers have gone to such lengths to cover up their mistakes, to make excuses, to try to scapegoat somebody else, anything other than say, wow, I really screwed up here and it hurt us bad. Mm-hmm. But here's Thucydides and he's making no apologies at all. He's just like, yeah, I screwed up. And Nietzsche says that has to be understood. Why? Why aren't they making excuses? Why are they putting their flaws out there for everyone to see? And Nietzsche and Smith and others say it's because they feel the clock running out, and they feel like if they've got anything to say, honestly, to make a difference, they better say it now, and they better say it clearly. And this goes all the way to why Aristotle has his style. Why does Plato have his style? Why do the Greeks write the way they do? They write like, this may be it. This might be all we get. So what you're talking about, Sharon, this issue here with that sense that a civilization has the same fragility as a life is something that the Greeks were very aware of, but the Romans were less aware of. They spent a lot of time trying to cover it up, because in the late ancient epoch, it was making them really uncomfortable. They were looking at the countdown and they didn't want it to be happening. And so they started to add all this, the emperor is actually a god, and, Rome will last forever, and this kind of stuff on top of it. And when you marry that to the rise of the Orthodox sect of early Christianity, you get a medieval epoch that argues that on the one hand, Jesus could come back at any moment and this will all be over and we'll all go to heaven or hell or wherever we're going to go. But on the other hand, until he comes back, will last indefinitely. That the medieval, structure of organization, they felt, wasn't mortal on its own. It would only be mortal when Jesus came back and said, we're done. And so it was sort of a provisional immortality that they were postulating and striving for. And that set them up to not really be able to deal well with the end of their epoch. Because when the writing was on the wall, when everything became corrupt, when they stopped really believing in the vital proposition of medievalism, they couldn't do anything sane or graceful about it because they were in denial. And his argument, and Valerie's argument here, is that moderns inherited that same abstract artificial sense of timelessness from the medieval epoch, rather than embracing the sense of pressing mortality that the ancients had. And so we need a Valerie or someone like this to write to remind us that, yeah, even God bless America, we're number one, all that, underneath all of that propaganda is a mortal civilization, a mortal nation that, is only going to be around so long, just like all the others. Phil, go ahead. You got your hand up.
Yeah, but seeing in that regard, it is possible to see that a civilization maybe is not infinite, but could last a long time as long as it's adaptable to changing conditions. There has to be enough flux and malleability, because even when you think about nature, let's not even think about ecosystem, but a specific species.
Yes.
Certain species has lasted a very, very long time, like crocodiles is an example.
Yeah.
While others have found dead ends, niches that didn't work, niches that last a medium length of time. So it just seems to me the frozenness of a structure is what creates its mortality. Not that the flexibility creates immortality, but a much longer passage from one epoch to another. And
let's talk about that.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that, because you're putting your finger on one of the central propositions of modernism. The central proposition of modernism is people will use their rational intellect to solve problems. And by doing that, we will shed the old rigid traditions of the past, by which they mean medievalism, really. And that will, the proposition of modernism goes, allow us to be immortal. It will be the end of history. And from now on, it will only be modernism, until the stars go out. We'll just keep adapting and adapting and adapting. And the argument is it's because we're more flexible, we're more adaptable. But one of the fascinating things about evolution is that some of the longest lived species aren't adaptable at all. What they've done is they're just beautifully tuned to their particular environment, and their environment has survived for hundreds of millions of years. The chambered Nautilus has hardly changed at all, and it has a very specific lifestyle. If the conditions changed so that those niches weren't around anymore, it wouldn't thrive. The coelacanth is another one. There's a long list of these that are, sort of frozen, and they fly in the face of the orthodoxy about modernism. The orthodoxy of modernism saying, it's infinite flexibility that provides for an extended life. But here we see these very not flexible things that have nevertheless managed to survive for a very long time. And so it argues that the actual relationship of mortality and flexibility is a lot more complicated than we think it is. And one way to put it is that there are two different strategies evolutionarily. And one strategy is to be very, very, very good at what you do. There's a quote, and I can't remember who says it. Oh, it's Archilochus, who's an ancient Greek writer. And he says, the fox knows many tricks, but the hedgehog only knows one, but it's a very good trick, right? Mm-hmm. So if you can tune yourself to your environment beautifully, you could be in for the long haul as long as that environment lasts. And you will beat more flexible species because they're not as good at what you do as you are. But in times of transition, or in places where ecosystems are in collapse, then flexibility is a benefit. Then you want diversity and flexibility so that somebody else can take up the new conditions and start working on them. So from this angle, you might say Homo sapiens is not an end product of evolution because we've achieved maximum flexibility, but we're the opposite. That maybe a hedgehog or unchambered Nautilus is the end product of evolution, and what we are is a transitional species. And out of us will develop one or more other species that are better tuned to their environments than we are. Flexibility comes with its own dangers, such as an inability to distinguish right from wrong. We can try all kinds of things, and that might include death camps and genocide, right? I mean, we're very flexible, but we get hoist on our own petard because of that flexibility too. But it makes us well suited for times of change like these. Stephen and then Phil. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, I was just remember a 19th century philosopher warning us about our analysis of circumstances or even history. He used this little image. He said, somebody's gone to work on a roof, and then we discover them fallen to the ground and dead. So everybody assumes the guy lost hold of the roof and fell down and was killed by the fall. And then, but the philosopher says, well, but what if he had a heart attack while he was up there? And that was the cause of his death. But the same things all occurred. He still fell to the ground, already dead.
Right. Right.
And this is a question about the demise of, say, something like the Roman civilization. What was there a central cause? If there was one, do we have the right one?
Right. Right. It's such an important point, Stephen. Thank you. It's so important. So, along those lines, Kenneth says, if you want to understand moderns and how they imagine their relationship to history, one of the things you have to think about is the myth of Proteus. Proteus was an ancient Greek god who was a shape changer. He could become anything. And I can't remember if it was Jason or Theseus or somebody else, one of the Greek heroes needed to learn a secret that only Proteus knew, and needed therefore to defeat Proteus. But how do you defeat somebody who can become anything? And in the way that the tale is told, he grabs a hold of him and he changes from one thing to the next thing to the next thing, and eventually he submits and tells the secret to the hero. Kenneth says, and I'm sure he got this from somebody else, that for moderns, even though most moderns don't know their Greek mythology well enough to know about the myth of Proteus, their predecessors did. During the Renaissance, there was a tremendous amount of reading of Roman and Greek mythology, and that there was a conscious decision to model us on Proteus and say we would be the first infinitely flexible civilization, and that infinite adaptability would allow us to be immortal, not just to extend it, but to end history, because now we've arrived and we can do anything. You can see how the notion of a protean Homo sapiens goes hand in hand with the notion of overthrowing God and nature as sources of meaning, because we've made ourselves, through that definition, we become like gods. We recreate ourselves as whatever we want to be. And he says, you can see this all over the place. If you try to pin down a modern in an argument, they'll try to squirm out of it by denying that they had a position to begin with. They'll say, oh, that wasn't my position. My position is actually this other position. But if you go back and read it, you see they actually did have the position you accused them of. It's just that when they realized that they couldn't win that argument, they slithered out of it and denied they'd ever been there. And this is a very common thing for moderns to do, because proteanism, this infinite, morphability, is like very core to our survival strategy and our sense of ourselves.
Where are you reading about proteanism? Is it in the text?
No.
Okay.
No. Kenneth talks about it elsewhere.
Yes.
He talks about it elsewhere.
Because I didn't remember that.
Yeah. So Sharon, how about you and then Phil? Go ahead, Sharon.
Well, I heard Stephen say that what's the real cause of civilization, of a decline of a civilization? And one of the things I've thought about, that civilizations usually die from inside. It's the character of the people. And there's the sentence that really stuck out to me. He says, to the political illiterate and acute minds, no more need be said, no more than this. Aristotle's somber pronouncement on the Achilles heel of all empires. All who have reflected on the fate of civilizations agree that everything depends on the education of the young. So the
Yes.
flexibility depends on the people, but it takes a long time to build that flexibility, and that flexibility depends on the education systems.
Yes. Let's. I'm going to come back to that point in just a moment. I'm going to call on Phil first because he had his hand up, but I want to go to your point after that because your point is like the next big thing to explore in this. So go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, my thought come out of what Stephen said, about the man falling off the roof. And it led me to think about the relationship between cause and effect. My first thought was, when they used to think that, like old people often break their bones,
Yes,
the joints, and that's likely because they fell, and when they fell, they broke their bone, right? And then somebody challenged that, and at least some of the time is because they broke their bone. That's why they fell, right? So in a sense, but then that leads me back to the thing. Well, is David Hume correct? Like all we have is relationships. We and what Kant was trying to do was to save it from this sort of chaos, which for some reason David Hume seemed to be comfortable. Well, this and that happened. I'm just going to go on living, no problem. While Kant is very worried about it, and said, no, we got to fix this because we don't know where things are going to go if you just sort of like leave it that kind of wishy-washy. And so that becomes an interesting problem because, like,
yes,
it almost seems like we are so driven by at least intellect. I kind of think life too is driven by the fact that there's some understanding of the relationship between cause and effect. Now, life itself, let's say trees and hedgehogs. I mean, hedgehog just got lucky. They somehow found something that seemed to relate. But even then, like a real catastrophe, like an asteroid could come in, and maybe that wouldn't save the spiky spines from saving them. So it seems to me at some point you have to like figure out some, I don't want to say middle ground because that seems like, like somewhere in the middle between cause and effect is the right way. But how do you weave the relationship between, let's say, something that has to do with like, well, just let everything go. We don't really know, just like go by the feel of it. And then what to the degree of, let's say, let's just really pin it down. It seems to me there has to be a web of interconnections rather than just finding the midpoint, because the midpoint doesn't seem correct because they're not so much a balance. It's somehow there's some relationship about the overlapping that creates a structure that's possible that you hold on to something that is deeply committed, but on the other hand, other things could float more fluidly. So I guess that's a question of cause and effect that seems like we all believe in some sense, but nonetheless, it's a problem necessarily to print down, and yet we feel uncomfortable to say, well, like chaos is great. Let's just let it go.
there's a quality to biological systems that Christopher Alexander writes about in his series, The Nature of Order, especially in volume 2, The Process of Creating Life. He says, one of the things that you find in mechanistic systems is that there's a big bang up front of manufacturing and construction. And then it's followed, and then it's over. It doesn't happen anymore. And then you have a long period of use and gradual wear before you get into the end stage where the use has caused the wear that is now causing the machine to break apart. And he says biological systems don't work like that at all. The way biological systems work is you have, instead of a big bang, the process of creation happens in tiny steps, but it keeps happening over and over. So it's incremental, but it's iterative. And as a result of incrementing and iterating that increment over and over and over, what you get is laws of big numbers start to come into play that don't apply when you have a big bang design approach like you do with machines. And the result is that small things can add up to big things gradually through stages that you couldn't ever draw a line and say, before this it wasn't and after this it was. It's more like across this entire time it was becoming. And part of what's fascinating about especially multicellular organisms, but actually if you dive down into the details inside of a cell, even single cellular organisms have this quality. You find that it's not just iterative and incremental. It's also that many, many, many separate systems are independently incrementing and iterating towards producing life. Yeah. Right? It's like a bunch of lines pointing in the same direction from different angles, and that they reinforce each other and affect each other. So you've got this, it's not even just a line, it's not even just a weave, it's a weave full of lines that are all trying to point back towards being alive. And the consequence is, although on the one hand we're fragile, on the other hand we have real staying power at the same time. People can take serious injuries and keep going. And not just people, any living thing can take quite a wide array of injuries and recover from them and keep going, because the rest of the weave is still pointing in the right direction, and the organism will try to put itself back together again. So this makes the issues of birth and death and health and sickness really hard to characterize according to the law of the excluded middle. There's like, you know, we cherish, as the accountants among us cherish moments like birth and death, because finally there's a line. Before this, you were not in the world, and now you are. It's like, thank God, finally a line. But, you know, the truth is you were already becoming before you came out into the world, and an awful lot of important development happened inside the womb. In fact, some might say most of the most important development that made you alive at all, which is why in some cultures they try to make conception the beginning of your life instead of birth the beginning of your life. You know, it's like, it's such a hairy issue. So you're right to be pointing at this and saying, you know, these are tricky issues. Why did the guy have the heart attack on the roof? Well, that gets into all kinds of things. Again, we're into the mesh of interconnectedness that the ancient epoch was so comfortable with, but that the modern epoch doesn't like at all, because we want everything to resolve down to, you know, true or false, to numbers, to clear yeses and nos. So
can I just say something that I find fascinating in this discussion? The guy had the heart attack on the roof, and the old man fell and broke his hand because of the caliber of that organism. If a 16-year-old was on the roof, he probably wouldn't have a heart attack. And if a 16-year-old fell, he probably wouldn't break his hand. So what I'm saying is about civilizations, you get an effect because of the caliber of the system, in this case, the organism itself.
Yes. Yes. I'm going to call on Trevor in a second, but first let me follow up on that. So I've started teaching an introductory martial arts course to some friends. And one of the things we talked about is the body as a system of biofeedback loops. And that many things that we think of as objects, because modernism imposes this mechanistic perception of ourselves as a machine, can't explain the way that the bones behave. Like in the case of a bone breaking, osteoporosis, the dogma is that osteoporosis either comes from not getting enough calcium or from having some disease condition that makes the bones brittle. And what's missing from this is a recognition that the bones aren't objects. You know, there is no object in the body. Bones look like objects after you cut everything else away. And, you know, you can do that to any organism, say, behold, I have produced a part. But it's not true. Those bones are all made up of cells, and those cells have the same DNA as the rest of us, right? It is a region within us, not an object. Mm-hmm. And it is still interconnected to everything else. And the key way to understand this is that enormous amounts of the biochemical metabolism of the body need to have calcium handy, not as a catalyst, to accelerate, the reaction, and not even as an ingredient to become part of the resulting chemicals, but just as, and I can't remember the term from my chemistry class, but one way to think about it is like an anvil or a table on which the rest of the chemical reaction is going to work. So the calcium gets brought in. The biochemical reaction is now able to take place because the calcium is present. And then as one of the late stages of the chemical reaction, the calcium is separated back out again. And you end up with a new molecule that your body needed to be able to produce that had to have calcium present, but let go of the calcium afterwards. Yeah. So as a result of this, there's always a lot of calcium in your blood, just moving around throughout your body, being kept available, just like you have to have glucose and oxygen. You have to have a certain amount of free floating calcium in your blood and in your lymphatic fluid and in the fluid between the two that washes the tissues, so that the cells have access to it if they need it. Where do you think that calcium comes from? It comes from your bones, right? One of the big advantages of your bones for the body of creatures that have complex biochemistry and metabolism the way we do is that they act as a bank. And your body's constantly, even if you do nothing wrong in your life, even if you live the bestest of all possible lives at the peak of your health, your body is relentlessly going to be sucking calcium out of your bones because it needs that calcium. It's got to be in the bloodstream or else all kinds of metabolic processes collapse. So the question is, if your body's always subtracting calcium from your bones, how does it get back in? Why don't you just immediately get osteoporosis by age 4 and collapse with brittle bones? What is the mechanism by which calcium re-enters the bone and the bones re-strengthen themselves? And the answer is really interesting. Have you guys heard of piezoelectric charges? Piezoelectric charges?
Heard of what?
Piezoelectric charges.
Oh, no.
There are crystals. This was a great discovery in the history of physics. There are crystals that if you put them under pressure, they generate an electric charge.
Yes.
We use this as the basis for a lot of modern, electronics. For example, you can use that as a pressure meter, right? The crystal will generate a charge when pressure is placed on it. If you have something nearby to pick up an electric charge, when the electric charge happens, you can now conclude that there was pressure put on the crystal. So piezoelectric charges, can be, that is just straightforward, simple electricity once it's been generated. And the calcium in the blood is not in stable molecular form, it's in ionic form. That is, it has an electrical charge. The electrical charge of ionic calcium corresponds to the piezoelectric charge that's generated when your bones are put under pressure. And so the bones will automatically, as a result, if I squeeze my fists, if you squeeze your fists right now, you're putting them under pressure. And then when you release under pressure, as the fluid flows back in around them, it carries in calcium ion laden fluid. And a small number of those calcium ions will be pulled back into the bone structure, and the crystalline structure of the bone will grow, sucking back in the calcium that otherwise would have just been flowing around. If you don't do this, if you don't put your bones under pressure on a regular basis, then you will get osteoporosis in those bones. We are built to move. We have evolved to be creatures that run around in an environment and stress ourselves and pick things up and exercise. And just merely the process of moving and putting things under stress is enough to reverse osteoporosis and make the bones rebuild and suck back in the calcium that the body's been borrowing from the bones. The reason I belabor this is a really complex cycle, the calcium cycle that relates to the bones and the blood and so forth, and the metabolism throughout the body. And as a result, it's very easy to not think about it. Our brains like simple things. This is not a simple thing. And so it's easy for us to think, oh, I'm low on calcium, I should take calcium tablets. And if you don't get any dietary calcium, yeah, you certainly should. But just going for a walk can have a huge impact on your calcium uptake in a way that we don't often talk about, because we talk about the body not as an organism that's full of a bunch of feedback loops, but as a machine, and you put fuel in and you get results, right?
So Rick, I gotta interrupt here, because you nicely outlined the second part of the process, The
Yes.
first part of the process is that the parathyroid gland, which sits behind the thyroid, that's
Yes.
the one that oversees it. And you're right. You get osteoporotic, both male and female, FUH, if you don't do resistance training, if you don't add weight to those bones. That's absolutely right. But before we get there, we have a first violin, which are the parathyroid glands, and they're under the conduction of the pituitary. So it's a whole system. And what you've just described is the end point of it. And that's the one that we can most impact.
Yes.
You gotta get up and move your body.
Yes. So I'm going to call on Trevor in a sec, but the whole reason I took this excursion is what Kenneth is describing in this chapter is an organismic, an ancient organismic perspective on a civilization, that it's not a machine, but it's an organism, that all ecosystems act like organisms. And that if you have enough biofeedback loops pointing in the direction of health and vitality, then the organism will thrive. But if those feedback loops become interrupted, then the organism will begin to fall apart in ways that are difficult to characterize at the time, although sometimes we can look back afterwards and figure out what parts of what might have happened. In exactly the same way that Phil and Stephen, you guys have been talking about the guy who was on the roof and is now on the ground dead. You're trying to sort out what happened, and the issue is an awful lot of what happened could have been happening for years before this moment ever came. And it's only if we can see the threads, the weave and all the fabric and all the arrows in them to find out how many have come askew and are no longer pointing in the right direction, so that the civilization no longer has enough vital force to hold itself together against the trials of time and the various insults that it's going to receive, the damage it's going to receive. Trevor, go ahead. Go ahead and come off mute, and we can chat.
Hi. I was thinking about what you said before, Rick, when you were talking about how frequently you can see people making a claim in a discussion, but then later saying that they did not make that claim.
Yes.
Even when the conversation is textual, and you can just go back and review the text and see that they're not telling the truth.
Yes.
And then also how our culture seems to insist on representing ideas as true or false. And very often it's never been proven true or false. And there's literally no concern.
Yes. Yes.
And if you try to discuss it, there's people are not only not concerned about what is true, they have a very strong aversion to discovering what is true.
That's right.
And same thing with the guy dying of heart attack. This is just yet another example of the same phenomenon. But if you think about it, if you look around on planet Earth, there's not really any place or mechanism or standard or culture where we have anything other than this. The closest we would have perhaps is science, but science is kind of materialistic and it's pretty simple problem spaces compared to the rest of reality. So wouldn't it be interesting if there was if you think of a Twitter or a Reddit, but epistemology was fundamental.
Mm-hmm,
and if you had a platform that did not tolerate bad thinking, it was completely intolerant of it, you have a single error, it's rewrite it or you're off the platform. What might be the outcome of that?
Right. Yeah, I'm put in mind of the language Quechua, which has a grammatical structure called evidentials, where when you use verbs, part of the conjugation of the verb is to indicate how you know this. Is it something that you have personally experienced and witnessed? Is it something that everybody believes to be true? Or is it something that's just your opinion? And if you don't use the correct evidential on the verb, the Quechua people feel that you have either made a grammatical error, or if you persist in it, that there's something mentally wrong with you, that you should never confuse your opinion with what's true. And you shouldn't confuse either of those with common knowledge that people sort of believe together, that there are three different kinds of things and you need to be clear about which is which. But we look at, sort of politics in the world today, and not just today, but especially today, you can see an enormous amount of confusion that people have about the difference between what have they actually experienced versus what did they hear over the radio or read in an article. And they confuse the two and believe that because their favorite source has said something, it's as good as if they personally experienced it. They can't, and that's, to the Quechua, if it's persistent, it's a sign of a kind of madness, and they need some help. They need therapy. This is kind of, and I think, wow, English could sure use that, because we have big problems with this, right?
Yeah. What's this other language you say?
Quechua. It's a family of
How do you
of
spell
languages in South America.
K-A-T?
Oh, let me put that into the chat. Quechua. Here, let me go there right now, actually. Let's go.
I mean, the problem with that, though, is making that a prerequisite kind of dooms such a project to failure almost, I would think. Or it increases the likelihood that it will fail.
Well, what you could do is, here it is, evidentiality. Quechua and evidentiality. It's just fantastic. So, what you could do if you wanted to make a platform like that is that you would add some kind of feature so that when you're posting, you always indicate which of these things you're doing here.
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't have to actually change your language as long as the platform.
You just make it a forced, or if someone, it's like you can allow people to be casual until someone calls them on it, which would then kick off a workflow of things like this.
Yes.
And if you are unable to compete at this level, you're off the platform. So what you would end up with is you would essentially be skimming the brightest minds off the top of the, right? Because everyone that can't make the cut, everyone that can't think without making errors gets booted, leaving the best and the brightest of the subset of people that came onto the platform.
Yeah, or they could shift to observer mode, instead of participant mode.
Yeah. Or you could have tiers where, like, different grades. So you like grade 1, grade 2, grade 3 type of thing.
Yeah. So I think it's certainly an interesting subject. It seems like basic epistemological concern for what do we know and how do we know it, and do we in fact know what we think we know? It should be taught in kindergarten, but instead it seems like we don't ever teach it at all in many cases. So thanks for bringing that up. So let's go back to the text. I said that we were gonna. Oh, Phil's got his hand up, and then we'll go to what we're gonna do. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I think I'm really, I guess, impressed by your organic relationship to structures rather than a mechanical understanding of structures. And it seems to me there's a good side in this sense. At least with environmentalism, we're beginning to break the mold, right? They're beginning to understand that there's so much complexity in causation that, not only there's one cause another thing, but many things cause things, and things that cause something else may lead to that cause. I mean, it's just very, very complex that we reduce it down to, I guess I'm going to tell a story, myth. That's going to be it. So that's important to know. But I'm particularly interested in, well, let me say this first. With the mechanical thing, it does seem like all the structures need materials. And so it does lead to an extractionary culture, right? You extract material to feed the machine in that sense, whether it's the body or a real machine.
Yes.
But with the other thing, it just seems to me like there's a relationship that cause and effect has these feedback loops. And what I'm interested in, particularly when you explain about the bone, which never quite occurred to me it was that way, was these things that you I would term them facilitators, right? They make possible for interactions to take place. And I was just thinking, you know, when you mentioned that, how does that reflect for thought now in a kind of governmental structures that we could produce facilitators, because we do have a mechanical system. It flows up, it flows down, and you know, an interaction is at the cabinet level, and then it trickles down. But what you need in this sort of biological model is there's much more facilitation happening between the various organs and other processes that is lower down and higher up and all that. It's much more. And it seems to me, we used to think, well, those are interpersonal relationships that congressmen and senators have over a cup of coffee that facilitates the exchange of thoughts and information and all that. But now, particularly now that's broken down, it even cuts down that kind of relationship. How can we cause a government, structure a government that allows for much more of these ambassadorial relationship between various parts? I mean, an organ, after all, is an organ. A liver function as a liver, that's a primary purpose, but it has many other facilitating relationships with other organs that creates a whole body to work. How do we create those ambassadorial relationship between at least the major relationships so that they communicate and produce an organic whole rather than a mechanical whole as we currently have? I mean, that's interesting. I don't even know whether we have anything near the structure of this organic, you know, governmental structure at all. I mean, the closest we come is maybe like on the very high level, you have ambassadors to keep things in, like, let's not go to the level of a war, right? Let's have some sort of like dialogue agreement, you know. So I think that's just so complex for us to switch out of that, because we've been so much into that structure that's hard to really think of it, you know. Oh, the complexity, you know. People are going to say, oh, the taxation to make this possible. It's just, it's mind-boggling.
Yeah. Well, I'm lucky because my professional community for a while was an organic learning community. From 1984 to, I'd say, the mid to late 90s, it was functioning in the way you're talking about, where it was reorganized and wasn't a hierarchical structure of imposing the ignorance of a small number of people upon a large number of victims, but instead it was this process by which the expertise of the many medical experts flowed upwards and kind of drove the activities of the people who were in charge of the software. And we didn't really start to get in trouble until we reorganized into a hierarchical structure, because people wanted to be more responsive to the president and Congress. Once they did that, the only way you did it was to cut off access for the doctors to be driving the programmers. So that reality principle that science is supposed to provide, you know, the evidence of actually what happens when you use this software, was removed from the equation. It became more like a standard government, started to fall apart. So in this way, it's like a special case of what he's talking about here in this whole chapter. Even from this opening paragraph after the Valerie quote, he's talking about examples of ways in which, if more and more of the threads that are supposed to be pointing and giving incremental iterative direction to the civilization to hold itself together, if more and more of those are peeled away, then you start operating more and more on momentum instead of on living force. And momentum is too easy to dislodge. You know, you hit a crisis and now you're bounced off a different direction. So he talks about the example of, you know, if a small number of people have too much power, then their personalities warp the civilization, right? You don't just get their benefits, you also get their drawbacks. Whatever their vices are, become the entire civilization's vices. This was one of Aristotle's critiques of despotism or of oligarchy. Yeah, and Plato talks about it too.
Yeah.
But then he goes on to say, it's not just that. if the youth are given too much of an incentive to tune out and not learn about how the civilization works and not care about what the civilization is doing, then you end up with a new generation of citizens who aren't actually engaged. And if they were engaged, it would be bad because they don't know how anything works. They spent too much of their time, trying to escape it all. And so there's ways in which you have to think about, are you creating perverse incentives that draw people out of alignment, that draw them out of involvement with creating a healthy ecosystem? And then the next phrase about despoiling the natural world, he's talking about it's not just what the people do that point to civilization in the direction of health. As indigenous cultures understand, people are part of a larger ecosystem. The whole ecosystem has to be pointing in a direction that could be healthy. And then the culture has to harmonize with that and reinforce those arrows to keep a health-sustaining civilization. So even if everybody within the civilization seemed to be concerned with and caring about that civilization, but they were cutting the foundation out from under them by poisoning their aquifers and, like in the Dust Bowl, if they were destroying the topsoil, then it doesn't matter how coherent you are seemingly as a culture, because now you've destroyed the capacity of the land to carry you. And so you'll fall apart for that reason. This happened in Rome in a couple of ways. Rome had a lot of topsoil loss. During a period when they were trying to build up their navy, they chopped down enormous forests, but they chopped them down not in random places, but they tended to chop them down in riparian areas, which led to enormous erosion down into creeks. That's what destroyed Ephesus. Ephesus, upstream from Ephesus, the forests were all chopped down to make naval fleets. And the silt washed down the river and pushed further and further and further a great flatlands that silted up the harbor of Ephesus. Used to be the second richest city in the world, and eventually was entirely abandoned because they couldn't reach the sea. There was a whole late stage period of Ephesus where they were dredging out the increasingly extended mouth of the river to try to make up for all the silt coming down, but it was hopeless. Because the problem was upstream. They destroyed the ecosystem of the river they depended on, and they didn't understand ecosystems well enough to know that that's what they had done. The same applies to anybody. If you trash your foundations, your house falls down.
I think it would have been obvious to them about the tree felling and the erosion. They would have seen it.
Well, what happened was, by late stage antiquity, some people were still clinging to the indigenous understanding of the relationship between people and the land. Other people got too caught up in the egotism of the Roman Empire. And for them, the important thing was, are we militarily strong? Can we defeat Egypt? Can we, they were so focused on their goals that they decided not to think about the other stuff. So you ended up with, and this happens a lot in civilizations, you end up with a compartmentalization within the culture between the people who understand the problem and the people who don't understand the problem. The worst thing that can happen for a civilization is if the people who don't understand the problem are the ones in charge, because then they'll impose their value system, which is mistaken.
Okay, the guys nearby might have seen the problem, but the big guy who wants a big navy says, damn it all, give me the big navy.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. He says, what do I care about Ephesus? If we lose this other battle, it's not going to matter. So we'll just go ahead and trash the ecosystem of Ephesus, but I still win. Except he doesn't understand that he's cost himself so much trade goods, so much taxation that used to flow through Ephesus is gone now.
I might add too, I've got a question for Kenneth Smith I've put in the chat there.
I saw that. I saw that. And, in a way, this whole chapter is about centripetal versus centrifugal. He doesn't have to say the words in order to be talking about exactly what you're asking. Because this issue of, are your arrows pointing inward like a centripetal force holding the civilization together? Or do they start to fall apart and point every which way so that the civilization tears itself to pieces in a centrifugal self-destruction? That notion of a culture not as an object like a Lego, but as a set of forces, and the set of forces can reinforce themselves or tear themselves to pieces. That the energetic nature of things. This is very Heraclitean, very Hegelian. That's I think the role that centripetal and centrifugal.
The post-war rise of the juvenile delinquent.
Yeah, exactly. Because you get a generation of youth who don't believe in the dream anymore after World War I, because the promise was just broken spectacularly, and nobody has come back afterwards and offered a solution. Nobody has said, you're right, this was terrible. Let's refound the dream of modernism by making the following changes. That didn't happen. They just decided to escape. We had the Roaring 20s.
Well, the mob becomes the ruler of Chicago.
Yeah, exactly. And then meanwhile, in Germany, there's such despair because the economy is so destroyed by the crippling war reparations that you get the rise of fascism. It's a direct consequence of all the other countries punishing Germany rather than thinking through what would be the long-term
I'll pick you up on that one.
Yeah,
fascism began in the collapse of World War I. That the fascists were reactionaries. Right. So they appeared before the Troubles. The Troubles might have extended their power, but what really happened, the Bolsheviks came along and thought, this is our moment. Russia's gone, we can do the rest of Europe.
Right.
One problem with the Bolsheviks, as Nietzsche would say, they were such purists. Any socialist who deviated slightly from their program was viewed as the enemy.
Yes.
And suddenly these socialists realised, my God, we're next. They went and joined with their opposites, the nationalists, for mutual safety. Mussolini said, it was obvious, we're going to be picked off one by one unless we band together. And so the fascists were a banding together of disparate forces to oppose the Bolsheviks.
Right.
The trouble is they did a good job in a lot of country of stopping the Bolsheviks, if you regard the Bolsheviks as a great evil. The trouble is they continued to exist, and then they started to think, what's going to be our program? And you've got to look at this. Fascism created its doctrine after it came into existence. Mm-hmm. Hey, we're called fascists. Do we have a doctrine?
Right.
Then they had started writing it, whereas the Marxists had been creating their doctrine for a century or so. And the Bolsheviks were the creation of this long history of a doctrine. But the fascists weren't. They just simply came into existence as reactionaries, as the Marxists called them, reactionaries against us. And we are the truth, after all.
Right.
So don't lose this historical moment which created fascism.
Yes.
The post-World War I effects later on, that might have strengthened the fascist role, but it didn't create them.
I agree. But, on top of that, what Wilson and the rest of them did to Germany created a situation in which Germany really didn't have a lot of choices. They could either suffer or they could become fascist. They could embrace the fascist message and strengthen their country in order to be able to oppose the rest of Europe. Because if they didn't do that, wheelbarrows full of money being wheeled down to the bakers to buy a loaf of bread, that was insane. That was never going to be sustainable. And it was idiotic of the Allies to do that. But, they were thinking in traditional terms, punish the bad guys, we're the good guys, we're the winners, they're the losers, etc. And thus they created World War II themselves without understanding that that's what they were doing. This is when your use of the term reaction is very useful here, because that's the thing about an organic system, is that there's all these forces at work, and you can't take any action within that system without the other forces responding. So if those who are governing don't understand the forces at work in the civilization, then that means they don't understand the consequences of their decision making. And so you end up with, Oedipus Tyrannus. You end up with somebody who's making what seem like reasonable choices, but that are resulting in terrible consequences because he doesn't see the whole picture.
Let me recommend a wonderful movie I saw recently.
Please.
A 2017 movie about actually the aftermath of World War I, called Goodbye Christopher Robin, a British film. Christopher Robin is the guy who wrote Winnie the Pooh.
Right.
So it's a very, very interesting and very sensitive film about the oppressive nature of what that is, and that led to a kind of dislocation. And I guess, I don't know if Winnie the Pooh is sort of a kind of fantasy that tried to knit it together. So a wonderful movie. I recommend that.
Thank you, Phil. Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, just a quick question, and it has to deal with like natural, and I've asked this before about like spontaneous order and things like that. Specifically, when it comes to economics, because this becomes a very, dicey kind of way of like, kind of like, then you talk about people that talk about no government involvement, no, let everything naturally. What would Kenneth's response be to that argument, to the just say the extreme free market, no interference economists of the world? Because that naturally you need things to you need to let things go naturally, so that when prices are go up, they go up through a natural mechanism, not necessarily through somebody regulating it or a mechanistic way of managing it. What would he say to that?
Well, he would say there was a period where the US tried that. And a lot of that was in the 19th century. And it led to extreme boom bust cycles.
Right,
that were just crippling for the country. The whole reason that they started to set up fiscal management was to try to put shock absorbers on what was otherwise these catastrophic crises that the country was going into just about every decade for a while. But I think another way to put it is that when people either are pro-government or anti-government, which is the kind of the way that the political parties like to play this game now, both of them are sort of ignoring the fundamental reality, which is that whether government is a separate institution for people or not, the moment there are two people in the room, you have to have politics. Politics isn't about what's sinful and gross. Politics is about how do you make decisions as a group. And the fantasy that nobody ever has to make a decision as a group, it just doesn't bear scrutiny. Anybody who's ever been in a family that's been trying to argue about which movie to watch or what to have for dinner understands that even at the most basic levels of human existence, we have to be able to make decisions together. Now, whether we stand up large institutions and delegate to them authority to do that on our behalf, or whether we find some other mechanism of negotiating our differences and coming up with a joint decision, this is a whole area to be explored, preferably scientifically, which we haven't really done. But it's almost impossible to get the nuance of that across to modern political partisans, because they're so caught up in their struggle about government is evil versus government is good that the fundamental issues are missing. One of the things that there's a Heraclitus quote that's not as well known, which is that people should fight for their laws as fiercely as they fight for their walls. And what he's saying is you have to come together and make agreements as a polis that bind you so that you can act together. Because if you don't, there are plenty of examples from ancient Greece of polises falling apart into civil war, what they called stasis. And when they do that, it is the very worst. Neighbors killing neighbors, family members killing family members. It turns into just the worst thing. The US Civil War being the war that caused the most US casualties is a classic example. Of all the wars that we bemoan as being terrible wars for us, the one that's the worst is when we fought each other. And the moment people start to think, well, I don't need this government to represent you, I only need it to represent me. My job is to beat you and defeat you and take control of the reins of government. That's a society that's headed towards its own self-destruction, because it's not viable, because it's pretending that we don't have to have politics. It's pretending that we don't have to make a decision together. It's forgetting what the consequences are of trying to completely, entirely oppress one group of people. It never ends well. It always creates the fiercest response. But if you want to hear Kenneth talk about it, and he would have interesting things to say, you could always add it to the chat as one of the questions that we want David Royal to pass on to Kenneth.
Oh yes, definitely. That's one of the ones that I've actually been thinking about for quite a while.
Yeah. So just type that in there.
Okay.
Just type that into the chat, and we'll capture it. Phil, you got your hand up, and then I'll go back to the text.
Yeah, but in what you say about this organic system, and particularly in relationship to governmental system, organic system seems to indicate that at least a species is restricted to a certain size. I'm wondering whether that's not the case with governmental organizations. I mean specifically things like nation states. When you have a nation state as complex and expansive, and so many diverse regions, and so diverse population, can you actually manage a system of that size that's beyond, maybe beyond organic structure, its ability to manage by the sheer size in terms of numbers and expanse in regions, to have it function without a sort of hierarchical structure at some point to manage even the diversity? Because, I just wonder, city-states operate to a certain degree because there's still a manageable size which you could come together to some agreement, although it creates a problem between conflict between city-states. But nation-states presumably is somehow wrapped up into a kind of empire that holds it together, and empires always seems to, at least in the past, have this sort of a hierarchical structure on top. So I'm wondering whether that's even possible to think of an organic political structure at all, due to the necessity of large states. I don't know if that's a necessity, but it seemingly seemed like a necessity. Large states to sustain itself against at least other large states who have a hierarchical structure.
I have 4 responses. I have 4 short responses.
Okay.
Short response number 1 is, this is a really important subject. I'm glad you brought it up, but we can't go through it today because it's too big.
Okay.
It would eat this call and the next, I don't know how many calls. You could do a whole book on this easily. The second is, we don't have any organic government structures anywhere in the world today at a large scale, which means we have no experience with them and we don't know what they can and can't do.
That's right.
The third answer is, we managed the software lifecycle for hundreds of hospitals across an entire nation using an organic governance structure. And it worked better than the hierarchical structure they replaced it with. The hierarchical structure they replaced it with is deeply corrupt and squanders billions of dollars.
Yep.
And veterans
Absolutely.
die because of the system that they put in place to replace the organic structure.
Yeah.
One of the things that we learned from working in organic structure is that it is not anything like the touchy-feely fantasies that you get out of people who don't like government or out of people who do like government. When they fantasize about an alternative, they never fantasize about organic government structures because they don't know what they are. They can't even conceive of them. So they always put in place something they know. So for example, anarchists will tell you that, theirs is an organic government structure, but it's not. It's structureless. That's what anarchy means. And being structureless, there are questions about its scalability. We don't know the answers to that. We tried anarchy. We tried to manage the VA software lifecycle by anarchy very early on, and that didn't work at all. So what I can say is that an organic government structure, in fact, has structure. It has authority, but it manages it very differently from anarchy and very differently from a hierarchy.
Okay.
The fourth and final answer is people have never managed to make a hierarchical government that can govern the whole world, even just the human part of the world. They've never succeeded. And at quite smaller scales, hierarchical government structures are deeply corrupt. And at bigger scales, they just get even more corrupt.
Yeah.
And the reason is because of a paradox. It goes like this. If you can't concentrate authority somewhere, then nobody has the authority to make a decision. If you can't make decisions, you're not governing.
Yeah.
Right? So you need concentration of authority to allow decisions to be made. The problem is the world is a complicated place, and you need an enormous array of expertise in order to make a decision well. But if you make a council composed of all of the experts that you need, it's too big to be able to make decisions. You're back to the same problem. So you either end up with ignorant, corrupt, but effective authority, or you end up with highly informed, dithering, ineffective structures. These are the two choices for hierarchical structure. These are really all there are. And every attempt to make hierarchical structure seem better is just a shell game hiding one or both of these flaws. So when we look at the structure of the cosmos from a scientific perspective, we see that it's organized organically, and it's able to manage scales of complexity we can't even imagine organizing through a hierarchical government. So this is one of the arguments that Christopher Alexander makes in his books, is that there is an entire other field of political theory involving how to create concentrated, effective, and yet kind of educated organic structures that mimic the way that nature governs itself. And the experiments that we've run with them so far suggest that they're tremendously more effective. However, for that very reason, they're excluded from possibilities because the existing power structures don't want to be replaced.
Yeah.
They hate them. They despise them and want them to go away, because the last thing in the world they want is to be replaced by something more effective than they are. You won't find any discussion of these kinds of structures in Marx. You won't find them in Hitler. You won't find them. Nobody who's proposing a utopia proposes these things because nobody has any experience with them. But we could have a discussion about it another time. Sharon, you got your hand up.
Yeah. So can we come back to the bit about education? Because I like the paragraph that follows it.
Yes.
And because I really believe that one of the civilizations take decline over time. And in my opinion, I think we are living in a declining time, because when I look at the caliber of our people, yes, and I think our educational systems, and I still teach students, are so far off the mark.
Yes.
You know? Yes. So I want us to discuss the paragraph that comes after that, where he said, Gibbon deemed it a decisive moment in the decline of antiquity that the Romans came at last to value education so meagerly that they routinely turned the task over to slaves, ensuring that the remaining generations of Roman patricians would be imbued with the mentality and values of slaves, whatever that was. But I do not know the mentality and values of the generation, but it is not, first of all, they're for the large part disengaged, extremely disengaged. And so therefore they're not in a position to make any decisions. Furthermore, even be rational about the decisions that they're making.
Yes.
That's because the education system, and even when you get an expensive education, it's not very efficient or effective. So I want us to, if we could just talk about that.
Yes. So yeah, let's work our way through this. Let's start with the quote. That's Aristotle, but it's not actually a quote. You can find variants of that quote all over the internet and on bumper stickers. but nobody has ever traced it back to an actual sentence in ancient Greek that Aristotle wrote. I spent several days trying to chase it down because it's such an important quote. But here's the thing, even though Aristotle never said that sentence, he did basically, in some ways it sums up the purpose of his entire body of writing. If you read his ethics, Nicomachean Ethics, if you read the Athenian Constitution, if you read his politics, if you read his rhetoric, over and over and over, he makes the point of this sentence in various words and various combinations. He usually makes it over the course of a paragraph or a page, or in some cases, it's the point of an entire book, but he never says it boiled down quite that way. So it's one of the things that I do for Kenneth when I'm putting his books together is I chase down his quotes, because since he's doing them all from memory, they aren't always exactly right. Sometimes there's a little detail wrong somewhere, or the attribution is off or something. Or sometimes, as in the case of this quote, it isn't actually a quote, it's a paraphrase. And paraphrases are fine, but it's important to let people know what they're looking at. It was through chasing this quote that I learned that there was an edition of Bartlett's Familiar Quotations sometime in the 60s, I think, where one of the editors inserted things that weren't actually legitimate quotes. And the things he inserted were catchy, and they caught on, and they're quoted all over the world. They're quoted on bumper stickers, they're quoted in essays, and yet the people that are attributed to have said them never actually said them. It's a little known blunder in the history of standard reference works, that there was this bad edition of Bartlett's that put a bunch of quotes out there. And that's where this quote comes from. Kenneth, he loves quotes, but he wants them to be real. This one isn't a real quote, but it is a real paraphrase. And if you read Aristotle's work, you will reach the same conclusion I have, which is that this is a fair paraphrase of Aristotle. One of the things to know about Aristotle is that even though we associate him with the peak of classical Greece, he was actually writing during the decline, and so was Plato. They were both, and Socrates, this is the Peloponnesian War. This is the point at which ancient Greece broke its promise to itself and began to devolve into large-scale civil war of exactly the kind the Iliad warned them not to do. They were starting to repeat the tragedy of their ancestors, and they couldn't seem to stop themselves. And they were saying it at the time, oh my God, what are we doing? And yet they did it anyway. And it was one of the signs that, the time was up for classical Greece. So when Aristotle writes this, he's not writing abstractly, right? The sentence reads as though he's making a general statement about civilizations, and he is in a way, but what he's really doing is saying, this is why we're falling apart. Looking around Greece today, seeing our collapse in action, having studied as a philosopher and as an educated person, having studied everything that is known by the Greeks and written down as much as I can, it seems to me that the reason we're falling apart is because we screwed up the education of the young. And what he was seeing a rise of was sophistry, right? Among other things. He was, he's writing before the Romans, before Gibbon's, the period that Gibbon is writing about. What he's saying is that I'm seeing people grow up who don't care about right and wrong, and they don't care about true or false. They just care about the social rewards of winning. They want to win the argument. And sophists are promising if you give them money, they will teach you how to win, regardless of whether you're in the wrong. For the Greeks, this was a catastrophe, because Peitho, the goddess of persuasion, was considered to be the motive force that made civilization possible. Their whole premise for Athenian democracy was, if we get people together and we educate them, then they will be able to create a marketplace of ideas in which they share all the ideas that are there, and they'll be able to use their gifts of persuasion to make each idea appear as well as they can, and educated people will be able to pick among them and find the truth and lead our government to the right choices. But it wasn't happening anymore. So the level, there's a reason why this is the second quote in this essay. the level of sense of doom and foreboding and catastrophe that we associate with Paul Valéry writing after World War I is also associated with Aristotle writing after the Peloponnesian War, right? Aristotle has that same sense that the ship of civilization is going down and will soon, go into the depths and join other past civilizations. And he is trying, he's writing as fast as he can, and he's running his little school, trying to spread the knowledge about what went wrong in the hopes that somebody can do better. The other critical thing to know about this is Aristotle was famous as the tutor of Alexander the Great. Mm-hmm. And Alexander the Great was the one who started Hellenistic civilization, right? During his lifetime, shortly after he's writing this, Alexander is going to take over Philip's, empire in Macedonia and sweep down, conquer the Greeks, and then spread out to create the largest empire that had been seen so far, all the way to India. And it lasts for a while. And part of the basis for that was the education that Alexander received from Aristotle, which was trying to pass on what did we do wrong, why did we fall apart, and how can you keep that from happening with the work that you're about to do, young man, as you inherit this empire. There is in this quote and in this whole discussion that Kenneth's going on here, including going into Gibbon, there is this strong sense of the responsibility for the generational transmission of wisdom, right? This essay is soaked in it. It's soaked in it, whether it's obvious or not. So that's the reason why, knowing that, now when you read Gibbon, you got to think Gibbon is writing, like 1,000 years, 1,500 years after the fall of Rome. And not 1,500, but quite a long time after the fall of Rome. And he's trying to explain why he thinks the Roman Empire fell apart. And it's not an accident that he is turning to Aristotle. Even though Gibbon's not quoting Aristotle, Gibbon's writing his own description, you can see the parallelism in the sentences and in the sentiments that's going on here. Because Gibbon has read Aristotle. Gibbon is an educated man. As an educated man of his era, that means he's read the classics. And among the classics he's most read is Aristotle, because everybody was reading Aristotle. So he's read Aristotle saying this sentiment. Kenneth isn't just laying these things on the page haphazardly. It's part of why I love this essay. There is a flow here of debt, intellectual and cultural debt. And he's going from author to author, passing the stick. So you asked about the mentality and values of slaves, right? And so we can't talk about slavery in the sense of the ancient world without the problem of slavery in the US and slavery in the modern world, because they're two different things. In fact, they're more than two different things, but they're definitely two different things in the sense that what a modern thinks a slave is going to be heavily saturated with the value system and worldview of modernism. Whereas what an ancient sees a slave as is going to be heavily imbued with the worldview and value system of the ancient world. So that means that in the ancient world, the ancient conception of slavery has to do with human nature, whereas the modern conception of slavery has to do with use value, right? It's why when the US adopted slavery, we adopted chattel slavery. We wanted people as tools, as objects, because we see everything as tools and objects, as means to an end, right? We're pragmatists, which means we have no core value system. We're just about getting done effectively the things that we want to do. And so if we think that, devastating Africa and stealing its population to be used as human tools will get us what we want, then of course we'll do it because we're moderns. There's nothing to stop a modern from sweeping right into the abyss.
Well, the Africans cooperated with that process.
Yeah, but it doesn't change what we did. We say that white people say that all the time, but it doesn't change what we did. We did what we did, regardless of who else cooperated with us. And we have to take responsibility for the ethical consequences.
And weren't the only ones buying slaves.
Yes, but that doesn't matter. It's like if you come home and you have two kids and one of them broke the cookie jar while trying to steal cookies and the other one stole money out of your jar, one of them doesn't get to excuse the other by pointing at the crimes the other one did. They're both bad, right? So yeah, there was Islamic slave trade. There was slave trade inside of Africa. None of that matters when it comes to our ethical culpability and how we reason about the world, right? They're separate discussions. The fact that there is a historical context and that we saw other people doing it and said, cool, let's do it too, that, in no way excuses us.
Well, okay, why do you think they moved from indentured servitude, the rules associated with that, to chattel slavery in the American colonies? Why did they do that?
That's a long discussion. It's a long discussion. And we can have that discussion because slavery is going to come up over and over in this book, but not today, because otherwise we won't get through this opening. And I want to get through the opening, but I won't forget, Stephen, I promise you, we're going to talk about those things. The point I'm trying to make is to separate the modernist conception of a slave, which is a human being reduced to the level of a pragmatic tool, versus the ancient conception of a slave, which is that they believed that different human beings had different characters and some people were not fit to govern themselves. And if someone's not fit to govern themselves, then somebody else has to govern them. That's the basis of all ancient government. Whether it's Greece, whether it's Mesopotamia, Egypt, whether it's the Romans, they all have underneath this concept that people have differing capabilities according to their character, and that an enlightened civilization would be like a family in which the parents try to take care of the children and raise them as best they can. And if people can be raised to be fit for politics and to be free citizens, then they should be. But if they can't be raised to be free citizens and fit for politics, then they should be raised to whatever level they're capable of, and then that's the level of life that they should engage in. This is what the Athenians said, right? This was their argument. And this is why when the Persians came to Athens and looked around, they were angry because they couldn't separate the slaves from the free people. They all looked the same, because the only difference was the slaves couldn't vote. That was, otherwise they could pretty much get along in society. They could do all kinds of things. Now, other parts of the ancient world took this differently, right? In particularly, two things to point out. One is Egypt. We talk about Egypt from time to time. One of the most important things to know about Egyptian slavery is we know surprisingly little about it because we've been propagandized with Exodus. We think that what Exodus says happened is actually the way it was. Most people still think slaves built the pyramids, and we have now discovered archaeologically they didn't, that the pyramids were built by craftsmen, middle-class people, because we've discovered their towns and their houses where they lived next to the pyramids. And they were, for the time, nice houses. They had their own burials. They had everything that a citizen of Egypt would have. So it means that we can't look at Egypt as an example of ancient slavery because we're very confused about it. Maybe in another 50 or 100 years, we'll have cleared out enough of the clutter that we could have a meaningful discussion about it. But other than an Egyptian specialist, most of us aren't qualified anymore to talk about Egyptian slavery. But we can contrast Roman slavery. And that's what Gibbon's talking about here. And we can contrast Spartan slavery with Athenian slavery.
Oh, yeah.
In Athens, the ratio was about thirds. According to Hannah Arendt and other writers, about a third of Athenians were free. About a third of Athenians were banausoi, who were craftsmen or traders who worked in the market. And about a third of Athenians were just, douloi, were slaves. And they worked on the estates. They did farming. They did household work. That was the level that they were considered competent for, but you wouldn't give them money because they'd run off with it. That was the thought. That's what the Athenians believed. So they sort of had this slave category, the sort of half slave category of traders, but you don't let them vote. And then they had this category of free people. But in Sparta, the ratio of free people to slaves was much more extreme. Yeah. And as a result of that, Sparta had trouble with slave revolts all the damn time, right? Because the vast majority were slaves. And they're like, why should we all be in bondage to you? Do we believe that the basis for slave revolts in Sparta was that the Spartans were disobeying the ancient ethic of slavery. That is, they were not allowing competent people to be freed, and they were not enslaving incompetent people who happened to hold power. They weren't It wasn't a true meritocracy. People weren't allowed to rise or fall to their natural level according to their character. And nature was the basis for the definition of how society was organized. So since they were betraying that, the slaves felt no compunction about, periodically revolting and trying to overthrow the free Spartans. So the Spartans responded by creating a society in which they terrorized the slaves. They, periodically murder slaves just to show who's the boss. And they became an ultra-fascist, ultra-militarist society. Really kind of a dystopia in a lot of ways. So the point of emphasizing Athens versus Sparta is to show how when we talk about slavery in the ancient world, we're not talking about a single kind of thing. There was a much greater diversity. Okay. What it meant to be a slave was really an open question. It depended on where and when you were. If you were a slave in Athens, but you had self-control and you were productive, you could buy your freedom and become a citizen. You could eventually work your way out of slavery. So in that sense, alluding to what Stephen talked about, in some ways, to be an Athenian slave was closer to being an indentured servant, right? At least during the Golden Age. But that was not true in Sparta. It was nearly impossible for a Spartan slave to become free because Sparta imposed a caste system. So let's talk about Rome. Roman civilization reinvented itself periodically. That was how they did their conquests. So when Rome spread to take over the other Italian tribes, they integrated the other tribes' deities, and they retold their own origin stories, the Roman origin stories, so that it became an origin story for all of the people that were in Rome now, and not just for the citizens of the one city-state. The same thing happens when the Romans conquered Macedonia, when they conquered Hellenistic civilization. They rewrote their own history. You've all heard of Romulus and Remus, the founders of Rome. That was the old story under the Republic. But after the Romans conquered Macedonia, I think it was Augustus who commissioned Virgil to write a new national epic about the origins of Rome. And they rewrote it so that the founder of Rome came from the Trojan War and was a survivor, a Trojan. That's what the Aeneid is about. Aeneas, is a daughter of Aphrodite, and he's one of the lone survivors of the Trojan War. That's going to come up later in this essay. He's going to quote Aeneas. It's relevant. And they did that because by creating a shared origin story, they were effectively saying, it's not us versus you. We're all Romans together, and we're all related and have shared the same historic tribulations. You know what I mean? We're not just some tribe from Italy that's imposing ourselves on you. We deeply care about your national epic, and really it's our national epic too. You following me so far?
Yes.
So it meant that their approach to slavery worked similarly, at least during their golden age. Their approach to slavery was they tried to endorse that Athenian ideal of, your own character will determine whether you're free or whether you're a slave. If we screw up and you start out as a slave, but you never should have been, we're going to make sure that there are ways for you to earn money over time. And to if you are disciplined and frugal, you can buy your freedom and maybe you can become a citizen. And, they used the army as an example of a way to do that and so forth. They were promising the Athenian meritocracy in the structure of slavery that they created. That was, whether they delivered or not, we're going to talk about in a second, but that was the promise, right? And although it's a lot less well known, they did it again under the Flavian emperors when they conquered Jerusalem. During the Jewish wars, at the time of the Jewish wars, 10% of the citizens of the Roman Empire were Jews. This is not well known. There were an enormous number of Jewish citizens, not citizens, of Jewish, members of the Roman Empire. And the problem they were having is that the Jews believed in, extreme monotheism, and they would not worship the emperor. They were not willing to, to show the basic respect. And they got to where they didn't even want to, hand over coins as taxes. So the Flavian emperors fought this fierce war. They conquered the Jews. And then the Flavian emperors also tried to reinvent Rome and the Roman story by embracing the nascent Christianity. There's a new book out about this called Creating Christ that talks about a little known chapter when the Flavian emperors embraced Christianity and said, some of you Jews are really violent and you're constantly fighting against us. We just want everyone to be happy and together. And why don't you follow this Jesus guy instead of, all these other angry prophets who tell you to fight us? And so there was a sort of an imperial endorsement of Christianity long before Constantine as an attempt to help pacify the Jewish rebels after they were defeated. And as part of that, the Flavian emperors actually declared themselves to be the Jewish messiahs. There's actually an argument, you can read it in Josephus, where they're saying that they are the messiahs prophesied by Jesus. When Jesus says, in your lifetime, these things will come to pass, the Flavian emperor said, oh, they meant us. we're the things that were coming to pass. And so let's all just be friends and brothers together, say the Flavian emperors to the conquered people in Jerusalem. It's a fascinating stage of history, but it shows the extent to which the Romans were constantly trying to use religion and propaganda and restructuring their own origin stories and their promise of meritocracy. They were all built around trying to incorporate each new large expansion that Rome did. Now this backfired. Some of the Flavian, the post-Flavian emperors did not approve of what the Flavian emperors had tried to do. They rolled back this part of history. They rolled back the argument about Roman emperors being Jewish messiahs, and they basically shifted modes into a more aggressive, do it because we're in charge, because we say so. And that break in history, when they stopped trying to promise Rome as a meritocracy and started to make it be more do it or else, is a point at which the value systems of slaves changed in the Roman Empire. Yeah. Because rather than raising slaves to be the best that they can be and to lift themselves up if they can and eventually buy their freedom, they created more of a caste system in which slaves are slaves and free people are free people. And maybe occasionally we'll let someone from the ghetto, make it good just to prove that it could be done. But most of the time we're going to keep people in the ghetto down because it's just handier for governance. So what is it that Gibbon is saying when he talks about the mentality and the values of slaves, right? He's talking about the core proposition of the ancient world, which is that people should rise or fall according to their natural character. And that people who cannot govern their appetites, who can't discipline themselves, are only fit to be slaves. This is what the Romans are arguing. It's what the Athenians argued before them. It's what the Spartans argued, even though the Spartans basically, didn't follow that at all and didn't even pretend to. But the Romans pretended for a while before finally kind of, cutting way back on doing it. So what Gibbon is saying is that the children of Roman citizens, the children of Roman patricians, are being educated by people who have been taught to obey, who've been taught to submit, who've been taught to turn the other cheek, who've been taught not to fight for Rome, not to create Rome, but to submit to Rome. Because by this point, we're talking about a caste system in which there's a shift between those who command and those who obey. Rather than all being Romans together on a great ladder of character, we're still, in the late, just like we, in our understanding of modernist ideals, simultaneously hold the idea of progress and modernism that our 19th century forebears had, while also being supposedly above all that and more cynical and ironic. In the same way, the late Roman Empire, on the one hand, they believe in a meritocracy of character in which people can rise and fall, while on the other hand, they've restructured their society to make it not able to do that anymore. Yeah. They've created a basic contradiction between their promise and their execution. And that's feeding the corruption that's going to lead to the collapse. So Gibbon is saying that the new generation of Romans is being Roman citizens who supposedly are supposed to be free are being raised to submit and obey and just go along with the system. And that it's not their system, it's their predecessor's system, and they're just trapped in it like everybody else. If you ask millennials today how they feel, they'll tell you, well, we're still being paid the same minimum wage from decades ago, but houses are more expensive, like 10 times more expensive. Education is like 50 times more expensive. Healthcare is like 100 times more expensive. That basically whatever promise there used to be in America, that if you work hard, you can climb the ladder, that promise is now betrayed. We still say that the promise is there, but we have restructured housing, education, healthcare, and everything else to make it almost impossible to rise. And as a result, the new generation feels like they have no investment in this system. It's not their system because they have no stake in it. They can't own a home in it. It's just not possible anymore. And so as a result, we're getting a split, a generational split, where the new generation doesn't feel this is their country. Therefore, they're not going to do everything in their power to protect it. And the generation beforehand, which can't give up the reins of power because of their own perverse incentives, can't stop themselves from making the split worse. And so we educate our children the same way. You don't get to create the laws, but you have to follow them. You don't get to own a house, but you have to respect property rights. We're not going to give you an education beyond this. We're going to make sure it's too expensive for you to receive, but it's mandated that you go to school, and we're going to mock you for not having had a college education. They're being put into a no-win situation, which is very analogous to what happened to the late generations of Romans in the empire. Stephen, and then Phil, and then Sharon. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, I just want to bring up the issue of utopianism, and it's a subject which isn't explored very well.
Yeah.
I spent years with that slightly utopian feeling that somehow progress was going to, just give us that utopia.
Right.
But about 20, 15 years ago, I spent a lot of time researching the factors in civilization, the factors of economics.
Yeah.
And I realised that that's just a dream.
Yeah.
But the danger is it's not being discussed. I mean, Marx was expecting the utopia. He said, hey, we've got steam technology. Where's my easy life? Oh, you're robbing me. That was Marx's attitude. And this will be the attitude of most people who don't think, have this dream that around the corner is utopia. There's a whole load of people who believe it, and it's not discussed.
That's right.
And I want to point out that the utopia might be just a dream. People believe somehow technology, it will deliver it. No matter how much the world's population increases, that technology will always be ahead of the game,
right,
and will give us our desired worlds. And I'm pointing out there's a whole load of factors which say no.
Right.
But yet our whole media, political system is out there preaching utopianism. And will this be dangerous? Will the masses, when they realise that they're not getting what was being spoken about, will things suddenly change? Will I suddenly start to realise, well, why obey the law? It's not in my favour. It's not to my advantage.
Right.
But where is the discussion about utopianism?
Yeah. So utopianism, although I don't know if he even says the word once, is a central theme of this entire book. Because each epoch makes a promise. The way that the worldview and value system of an epoch is structured, the reason that different civilizations and cultures within that epoch converge upon that value system is because the promise is irresistible. For its place in time, given what came before, it's the promise that people most crave. And that's why they flock to it from a variety of backgrounds. In the modern world,
1,000-year Reich.
Yeah, exactly. That
Workers' paradise.
They're saying what you need to hear. What your situation has created intolerable pressures such that you have to hear this. This is what you wanted more than anything. The interesting thing about utopianism is that we pretend that it's an aberration of thought because we don't want to admit that it's the central promise of our civilization. Modernism made a promise. And the promise was, if we throw aside God and we throw aside nature and we come together to make decisions, we will be able to make the world better and better forever. It will just keep getting better. There will be a great march of progress. We'll never have to go back to the dark age, and our children will have a better standard of living than we will. That's not just some flight of fancy that some soft-headed person accidentally thought, nor is it just an ideological seduction of this strand or that strand within the political landscape of the modern epoch. That is the core value proposition of modernity itself. Utopianism is what it's offering. And it may not be able to deliver it. It might be a false promise. But when you scratch the surface of every noble thing ever written by a modernist, that's always what's under it. So where it really gets interesting is that in the medievalism, it was also utopianism, right? Medievalism said, Jesus hasn't come back yet. It's been 500 years. We don't have Jesus yet. We know that when Jesus returns, we're going to go to heaven, which will be a utopia. But until then, rather than being governed by these horrible, corrupt Romans, how about if we make a civilization governed by God and God's representatives to create a utopia here on earth or as close to it as we can come, right, while we're waiting for Jesus to take us to heaven? This is the core proposition of medievalism. Human governments are corruptible, God's not, so let's put God in charge. They're offering a utopia. It's just a different kind of utopia than what modernism is offering. It's not about a great march of progress. It's about being righteous people until the return of Jesus in the second coming. And even though we don't know the origins of the ancient epoch, and we really don't know the epochs before it, what we see of the ancient epoch strongly suggests that it too was based upon a utopian proposition. That if we live our lives according to nature, right, the nature of the natural world and the nature of human nature that should determine, our castes and our classes within our societies, then we will make the best of all possible worlds. So it's the interesting thing is that moderns want to believe that they're hard-headed and that they're not utopians. But there's a reason why we love Star Trek, because Star Trek visualizes the core promise of modernism, to rise from the muck, and step by step we work our way up until finally we're like gods and we're flying through space and able to do.
I'm with the Klingons.
You're with the Klingons, right? So, but at any rate, whatever the premise is, it will get better. If we just keep going in the direction we're going, it will get better. And that's a utopian
Well,
promise.
we had the Earthers, the Vulcanians, and the Klingons.
Right.
It's 3 different philosophies.
Yeah, that's right. But in the same way, in modernity, you can have Hitler, you can have Mao Zedong, you can have Roosevelt, you can have a wide variety of different formulations of modernism that can be so different that they sound like they're opposites until we see what the common value proposition is underneath all of them.
We have the Assassin's Creed.
Right.
Two parties which are at war with each other about the direction of culture.
Right. And yet they share so much in common. So thanks for that, Stephen. Yeah, we'll come up with utopianism over and over throughout this discussion because it's what's at stake. And the reason is, and you can see he's starting to talk about it in these paragraphs. And he's going to talk about it in the ones that follow. If you can't light up and capture the imagination of large numbers of people, then you don't have a culture at all. And let me say that again, because this is the crucial point. We have to be lit on fire so that our creative faculties are engaged with the project of forming a civilization. If that fire goes out, or if we get a fire to do something else, that tears apart the civilization. The culture cannot long endure. The civilization does not long endure. No matter how much we want to make civilization seem like a rational, calculated, pragmatic thing to do, at the core of it all is some great fantasy or dream that is irresistible to us, that we want more than anything, and that we're willing to make a lot of sacrifices to make happen. That's how a civilization gets over the difficulties to keep going. But if it doesn't have that, then what happens is the same thing that happened to the Roman Empire. You get to a stage where everybody's burned out. Everybody says it's so corrupt. There's no hope. The meritocracy has failed. The worst are ruling us. And when the barbarians come in and overthrow Rome, then unlike the previous times when you got back up and fought them off and reestablished Rome, this time you're like, it's just not worth it. I just don't believe anymore that if we put Rome back, anything will be better than if the barbarians come. Maybe the barbarians are better. Let's give them a shot. It couldn't be worse than what it was under these terrible, terrible Romans. And that was how the Roman Empire fell. Just one loss of faith too many, so that it couldn't get itself back up again after the most recent invasion. Phil and then Sharon. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I guess I have two questions. I'll let you choose which one to expound upon.
Okay. One
is this thing. Well, thank you very much for dashing our hope for utopia. but I will say that hope springs eternal in the human heart. Okay,
it does.
It's a place of grace, and it just seems to me it might be attached to something other than utopia, might be something else. But I was going to say that in a sense, the millennials are trapped, or modernity is trapped in this sort of vice, in which is like progress is not happening, at least for the individual, in terms of the, in terms of the actual gains in the, in the material culture. But in relationship to that, it has more to do with the deprivation rather than even the progress. Because you see that the top level is getting far, far ahead. And that gap in between is the deprivation. Not because even if you're a fairly poor American, maybe not the poorest, but fairly poor American, you really could still have a decent life if it was that alone. But the deprivation is what makes you very, very angry.
Yes.
At the problem, right?
Yes.
So I could understand that deprivation means that in some sense you have lost hope in the delivery, and at least in some relatively egalitarian way, not necessarily totally egalitarian, but just a degree of, a degree of compensation that seems just. So that's the problem. Now, as for myself, I think virtue is not a means, but an end to hope. That's what the fallen angel is about. Because if you have an end in which virtue is only a means to get that, then in a sense, you are using your virtue to be bought off into the end game. I think virtue itself is an end. So, and I think that's the way it ought to be. And if you pin your hopes on living the virtuous life as best you could, then in a sense, that is whatever that destiny might be.
Yeah,
it's correct. So that's the first question I want to ask you. The second question is about Aristotle.
Yeah.
I wonder. Of course, he taught Alexander, and I wonder whether that was a compromise on his part, because he realized that the political situation cannot sustain a kind of like a bottom-up relationship to education, and that he had to, in a sense, rely on the philosopher king to maybe deliver that possibility, which of course comes from his teacher, Plato, and that maybe that's not the ideal situation, but at least the world has become in which there was no hope other than searching out for the potential prince that will become the philosopher king. As a matter of fact, Alexander was very beholden to Aristotle. He actually, everywhere he went, he collected specimens to send back to Aristotle. I mean, it's like he was a disciple of sorts. So I wonder whether that was selling out or whether that he just a pragmatic person at that time say, well, the only hope left is in Alexander, and so therefore I will become his teacher. That's an interesting question, because in a sense, Alexander did deliver even after his death, because the Ptolemaic Empire was actually quite concerned about education, as far as I know. The liable Alexander. So I wonder. That's another question that has to do with history rather than the present. So you have the present or the history. You could either deal with one of those.
So let's talk about Alexander. I'll take the second one.
All right.
Kenneth says there's two important things to know about what Aristotle taught Alexander. And the first is we have no record. We don't know what he taught Alexander. We can only infer based on the kinds of things that Alexander said and the kinds of things that Aristotle said on his own beforehand, and the kinds of things that Alexander did afterwards. Mm-hmm. We can infer. And we can infer by comparing Alexander's behavior with Philip's behavior before him, and say, what vector change do we see in the behavior of the Macedonian royalty from the time of Philip to the time of Alexander? And I've heard him say that, but I've also heard him say that there is one thing in particular that Aristotle told Alexander. And I don't know how to reconcile the two. And maybe that's a question for Kenneth when he joins us. Maybe there is one thing that we know that he told him. But he says, Aristotle told Alexander, you will never conquer the Greeks. They love to fight. They love it. And of course, he's writing after the Peloponnesian War, which is followed by Thebes and then Corinth, having their own periods of taking over and being in charge. It had devolved into, a game of rotating who's dominating the rest of Greece. These guys love to fight. They will fight until you exterminate the last one. If all that's left is a little girl, she will fight you. It's like the Greeks love it. But you if you want to govern them, you must convince them to conquer themselves. Because if they conquer themselves, then their loyalty to you will be just as strong as their resistance would have been. And so what we see in the example of Aristotle is that he wanted to become a term that was used later just to describe Frederick the Great, a stupor mundi. A stupor mundi. You know this term? You guys seen this term?
No.
It's a great one. Stupor mundi. Let me see if Wikipedia can help us with this one, because it applies to Alexander the Great better than anybody I know. Oh yeah, there it is. Yeah, Frederick II. There he is. All right. So stupor mundi is a wonder of the world, right? Someone or something that just stupefies the world, that makes people go, oh, is that even possible? How can anybody be that amazing? So what Alexander did is he tried to personally embody all of the virtues that the Greeks most cherished in his one person. They talk about how in the past, the old gray-bearded generals of Greece would not lead the charge because they were old. Why would you lead the charge? You're going to be hobbling along at the front of the army. You're going to slow everybody down. You're not the best fighter. You're supposed to be the wisest, the tactician. You tell the great fighters what to do. But Alexander was young. So Alexander led the charge. You can read accounts of Alexander charging down a ravine and back up the other side right into the spears and swords of the enemies, leading the Greeks behind him. And the Greeks were like, no way were they going to stay behind with him leading. They're like, they had to keep, because they're competitors, right? The Greeks are all competitive. They had to keep up. And so he led them through his personal example, and then led them into doing things that Greece had never managed to do before. the level of expansion that he gave. And the whole time he did it, he didn't say, I did this. He said, behold the wonder of Greece. Behold the fantastic things that the Greeks are doing. And the Greeks were like, yeah, go us. Instead of saying, screw you, Macedonians, you can't impose yourselves on us. They were like, I guess we're all pretty awesome, aren't we? So he did exactly what Aristotle said, right? He fascinated them. He entranced them with his example.
Yeah.
Another example of what we're talking about is, you've heard it said, I've said it to you many times, that in the entranceway to the oracle at Delphi, were carved the words, Gnothi Seauton, know thyself. Those were not the only words carved there. There was an entire pillar, and it was full of aphorisms. Gnothi Seauton was only one of them. They also had, was it Mede Nagan, nothing to excess, right? And it's a list of like, I don't know, 50, 60, 70 aphorisms that was on this thing. Gnothi Seauton was just prominent. Everybody talked about it. That dated from an earlier period in Greek history, around the time of Thales, when the Greeks were concerned about wisdom literature. And they fell in love with this idea of the potent aphorism that speaks volumes of wisdom with only a few words. And they collected them from all the wise people of Greece, including Thales and others. And then they carved them onto this pole. Well, what Alexander did is everywhere he traveled, he had his people erect the same pole with the same aphorisms, spreading the most cherished sacred wisdom of the Greeks. You know, there's a pole like this in India. There's poles like this in Afghanistan. Everywhere that they went, they erected these things. So that ties together this idea of the supermundi, the way that he unites the Greeks by fascinating them, by embracing them and saying, this is not something I'm doing to you, it's something we're doing together. And by taking their most cherished values and spreading them far and wide. So the topic of education is right here, right? They wanted to be sure that the core wisdom of the civilization was before the eyes of the citizenry everywhere that they looked. And there's a reason why, I mean, this goes hand in hand with the project to create the Library at Alexandria, doesn't it? Right? We want to pull together all the best wisdom from all over the Hellenistic world, but now instead of just being aphorisms, it's going to be whole books, codexes, scrolls, whole works, and they're going to be all collected in one great place. And it wasn't the only place. They stood up others. Celsus, Ephesus, they all had great libraries as well. It became this project to do on a massively larger scale in the Hellenistic world what the Hellenes had tried to do on a much smaller scale within Greece before, and in their colonies, around the Mediterranean. So the Romans, when they conquered Greece, they studied this example, and they wanted to do what Alexander had done. They wanted their emperors to be even more a supermundi, and they made, among the slaves they had were Greek scholars. They wanted Greek scholars everywhere, sharing their wisdom, so that the Roman Empire could take on the wise aroma of Hellenistic civilization, if you will, the best parts of it. That's what they were trying to do. So as long as they kept it like that, like a meritocracy, it was one kind of empire. But the moment it froze into a caste system, it became a different kind of empire. And that's what Gibbon's talking about. Sharon, and then
Steve. Thank you.
Sure, Phil. Go ahead, Sharon.
So I want to come back to the text, and I have a question. So when he talks about the mentality and values of slaves, that's just metaphorical, correct? It's not actual slaves. And you have it right. You have it outlined right here. Mentality and values of slaves, and you expounded on it. So slaves here is not actually the laboring class. It's a metaphorical designation, correct? Or the weakest of the population, because he goes on to say modernity whose utilitarian contempt for education is famous and chronic, has achieved the same effect by putting our schools and universities in the hand of our own narrowly slavish personalities, petty-minded and pathetically conformist middle class, and the Lilliputian homunculi that oppose it.
Yes, yes.
And I think that's pretty much operative in our society today.
Yes.
And I look at the way we talk about critical race theory, which is not even taught in schools, it's a college course, and the big hullabaloo we have about it. And the people that are objecting to it can't seem to understand that it's not a high school course.
That's right. That's right.
So the concentrated intelligence of a mechanistic salivation runs down thus inexorably like a clock, imperceptibly to its own mechanical minds. And I think that's where we are.
I think so too.
I really think, and I think this is very well stated. The other thing that I wanted to talk about was this concept of utopia. It made me look up the definition.
Yes.
Because it said it's an imagined place or state of things in which everything is perfect.
Yes.
And in my eyes, the only perfect people are dead people, and then maybe not. So utopia, I don't think it's a living concept. To think while we're here, we're going to have to struggle and meet the challenge of living and find the joy in it. And if the politicians promise us that, then we should really be more discerning and not believe their misrepresentations.
Yes. So let's take your question, because the question is really important. Which kind of slaves are we talking about? And the answer is part of how an epoch in its age of corruption manages to keep going is through compartmentalization.
Yes.
It teaches people to play sophisticated tricks in their mind so that things can be one thing while being imagined to be something else. And that the person at some level, they understand you mean two different things, but on the other, it's really easy to confuse them and blur the terminology so that you can add the scent of meaning of one of the ideas to the other one, even if it doesn't deserve to be there. So an example of that is if you set up a meritocratic system in which a slave is any person who can't control themselves. So like a child, below a certain age as a slave. They and before they have teeth, they can't even chew food. So you could say people below this level of competence are slaves, and people at this level of competence are professionals and craftsmen, and people at this level of competence, they'll be our voting class. That's what the Athenians did, right? You can stand it up, and now slave means one thing. But if your class system in your society drifts out of tune with that and turns into a caste system, like it did in Sparta and like it did in Rome, and like it might have done in Athens. I actually don't know really late Athenian history during the times of the Theban and Spartan and Corinthian overlordship. I don't know how far it might have drifted out of tune with that. Then you have a second definition of a slave. And that definition is somebody who has been assigned the caste of a slave and is treated like a slave, regardless of whether or not they actually are a slave according to the value proposition of what a slave is supposed to be. So now you've got two definitions for slave existing side by side. And you better believe people play rhetorical tricks and mind games with themselves to try to justify. So, for example, if I were enslaved in Rome and I had a classical Greek education, and suppose that I was more disciplined than I am now, and I could control my feelings and my thoughts, and I ought to be eligible for citizenship, then what a Roman should say is that I shouldn't be a slave. I should be promoted out of it or buy my way out of it. But in the late Roman Empire, what they would say instead is, a priori, ipso facto, I must lack control because I am in the caste position of a slave. Mm-hmm. That is, they let the caste define me rather than my actual nature define me. And that is a corruption of the core proposition of the ancient world, which is that your actual natural character is supposed to determine how society treats you. This is what we see in chattel slavery. right? In chattel slavery, the US liked to enslave the best and the brightest. We wanted to enslave hard workers, smart people. So literally, people who in the ancient world should never have been treated as slaves were exactly the people we sought out to make slaves of. And this is why there were so many successful slave revolts in Central and South America, is you get all these people who had been, generals in Africa, and they knew how to organize militarily, and they put together, we talk about, in the US, we teach this history so badly. We talk about slave revolts as though it's just torches and pitchforks and random grumbling, but it's like, oh no, a lot of times they were extensive military campaigns where slaves were escaping because they were generals and they had strategy and tactics, and then going back and helping others escape and setting up, in some cases, whole cities in the jungles of Brazil and developing their own military forces to come back and fight against the slavers. I mean, slave revolt does not do justice to the level of sophistication of some of these battles. And it was the result of a modern approach to slavery that was an even more complete betrayal of the ancient concept of a slave than even Rome was able to pull off. We were enslaving the best and the brightest, right?
Okay.
And aside from that, we have the additional issue of treatment, right? So just because you say somebody's a slave, what does that mean? Well, during the golden age of Athens, it meant nobody could tell the difference. It just meant you never showed up to vote, right? But you had nice clothes and you could do what you wanted pretty much as long as you were running things. The people couldn't tell who was the slaves. But you look at the Old South in the US, and the brutality and cruelty made it physically manifest who was a slave and who was not by how horribly they were treated. So what we're seeing here is, to answer the question about, what is a slave and what does given mean by a slave, we have to be able to sort out these side-by-side differing definitions with the understanding that the confusion between them is being used by people on purpose to mistreat people, right? For political advantage, for gain, or for economic advantage. This whole area is a really complicated thing to get into because of these shifting perspectives. As moderns, we are trained to crave simplicity. We crave a simple world that just makes sense, where things that are true and things that are false are false. And this kind of gamesmanship with terminology and castes and treatment of other human beings, it confuses us very easily. So you will find people who say they're 100% opposed to slavery because, of course, what they're thinking about is, the horrific ways that we treated people in the US. But they're not questioning, well, what's your child then? Right? Does your child vote? Why not? Can your child drive? Why not? Why don't you let your infant play with knives? The concept of people who are not yet ready to run a civilization used to have a name in the ancient world, and now it really doesn't. We sort of treat them as a bunch of special cases. What about people who are, have mental disadvantages? What about people who have physical disadvantages so crippling that they can't get around? Like, what about a quadriplegic person? They can't necessarily drive a car. And we create a civilization in which, it's hard for them to get around. What is that category? What is their relationship to children? What is their relationship to adults? What is their relationship to, someone who never mentally develops above the level of a 4-year-old? All of these things, this is a whole area in which we kind of don't want to speak plainly.
I guess I'm coming at this from the concept of, Bob Marley, my favorite guy, and when he talks about mental slavery.
Yes.
Mental slavery versus physical slavery.
Exactly.
And mental slavery is a much more subtle concept. And lots of people live in mental slavery without even recognizing it.
Yes.
Now, physical slavery is easy to define because your slave master decides they're going to treat you a certain way, and society accepts that.
You can see it.
Yes. But the mental slavery is a lot more subtle. And the mental slavery is a mindset that you teach from one generation to the next, right? Yes. And it does not allow for a society that is protective and for a civilization that's going to survive.
Yes.
Because they keep looking for that utopia that Stephen talks about that doesn't exist.
Yes. Yes, exactly. And so what Gibbon's talking about here is the ancient conception of mental slavery. And specifically characterological slavery. People
Yes.
whose inner character, for whatever reason, makes them fit to obey and not fit to rule themselves. And what we're supposed to do about that is a whole separate question. But, you know, Harriet Tubman herself said, when she went to free slaves, there was always a subset that didn't want to be freed. And it was a problem because
that's why she carried a gun.
And so she had to carry a gun because they were so ruled by fear and by the longing to obey that had been beaten into them that they couldn't even disobey if it meant that they got to be free people. They still wanted to go back and thereby endanger everybody else. This issue of people who crave to conform, who want someone to give them orders so that they can do it. This is what Hannah Arendt writes about in Jerusalem, in Eichmann in Jerusalem, when she talks about the Nuremberg trials. She's talking about, when she talks about Eichmann specifically in his trial. And it's what the Nuremberg prosecutors talked about in Nuremberg, is how many people who seem normal on the outside actually crave orders. They crave regularity, conformity, obedience. They just want to slot themselves into a system and do what it says. And many of these people were the informers who turned in Jews. You know, you thought that they were your good neighbor, except that if they had the opportunity to hurt you by obeying, then of course they would do that, because obeying was more important to them than being a decent human being. These people are slaves.
And so further down, about 3 paragraphs down, I guess Kenneth Smith addresses it, because if the slaves are educating the next generation, then the ethos, he says, which is the highest code of a civilization, that the paragraph begins, it's defining scruples and imperatives, perishes by deformation, by neglect under the impact of myriad one-sidedness, fracturing, and idiotizing perspectivism, normal and ordinary ideologies. And that's the consequence of allowing slaves to educate the next generation. And what's the content of education is open for debate also.
That's right. That's right. That freedom and citizenship require a spirit that has to be cultivated. And that if it's not cultivated, if instead we cultivate obedience, then we're not raising free people, we're raising slaves. We're raising people who are only fit to fit into a system. And I'm gonna, I've got a lot of hands and I'll call on you guys in a second, but you can see how this relates to the discussions we've had before about modernism's mania for systems, noetic systems, mechanisms that you just push the button and they just do they do all the work for you predictably and reliably. And that's what he's talking about in that next sentence when he says, it perishes of no longer being publicly articulable and privately cogent, surviving then not as living spirit, but as the dead letter that killeth, right? The empty formulas of the system rather than the principles that are supposed to drive people to be able to make meaningful decisions. This is how civilizations die, because the world throws a wide variety of challenges at a civilization over time. And no system can be programmed in advance to know what the full possibility of those challenges is going to be. The system has enormous numbers of things it was never designed to handle. And the sweet spot for solving that is supposed to be the creative drive of the citizenry, who, when confronted with a problem they've never seen before, can come together and bring all of their creative intelligence to bear to come up with a novel solution for the civilization to overcome the crisis. But if you've been training people that that's rocking the boat, that's biting the hand that feeds you, it's wrong, it's criminal behavior, and that your job is to obey, then you create a civilization that's incompetent to creatively rise to challenge new problems, which means the very first new problem to come along is going to be the one that takes out that civilization. So this is part of, when we talk about the stages an epoch goes through from its birth to its death, by the point when it starts cataloging and categorizing and systematizing the rules everyone is supposed to follow, it's killing itself. It's already like Oedipus's parents, leaving him out on the hillside and not telling anybody who he is. It's already set in motion the tragedy that's going to occur. Because now you're going to raise a generation of people who follow those rules and aren't capable of thinking outside of them, which means that crisis is going to take out that civilization when it occurs. Stephen, and then Phil, and then Joe. Go ahead, Stephen.
I was just going to bring up the issue of this is looking, we always look at history in hindsight, and the trick is to look backwards and put ourselves in the shoes of the people back then. I've made this point before. Nobody seems to pick up on this, that you had the Greek geometric age. After the great disastrous dark age, the lights were coming back on.
Yes.
You're standing in Greece, you're looking at the horizon. Okay, there was a big dark barbarian world behind you, but the lights were coming back on. Egypt, you could see the light from Egypt. You could see the light from Babylon. You could see the lights from Asia Minor. You could see a few lights in the Black Sea. And then comes this great dark shadow called the Persian Empire that's swallowing up nation after nation. Now you're the Greeks, you're on the outskirts of civilization. You're the flame bearers of civilization. You're next to a barbarian world. But these Persians are coming along and swallowing light after light. And you're a Greek sitting in Athens. You must have thought, I'm next. It's hopeless. I better start learning Persian. But every day they would have woken up that their lovely little culture that they had going, that they were sitting there, you know, the Aristoi were having a great time, walking down to the market, going to the theatre. Man, I want it. Give it to me. But they must have been thinking, oh, this is a great party we've got going here. Socrates has been coming to the party. Everyone's coming to the party or whatever. All the philosophers are coming to the party. But you must have woken up every morning thinking that there's this great monolith called the Persian Empire ready to devour you. Mm-hmm. And historical hindsight just misses this. And I've always wondered, in part, some say it was that the tragedy Nietzsche was referring to was the breakup of the peace amongst the Greeks. But I look to this earlier time when Persian, it still was for hundreds of years, Persia looked like it was ready to roll over and crush Greece. This must have been a persistent fear.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Definitely. And the point at which the Persians arrived at the Greek colonies in Asia Minor was a big eye-opener for the continental Greeks.
No.
Because some of them had slipped into complacency and started to think, well, maybe it will never come here, because it had been there for so long. But once it started to roll over Ionia, then they had to get serious. Then it created that sense of dread in a redoubled form that you're talking about, where the thing that they had been fearing but trying not to think about became the thing they couldn't stop thinking about. And now they had to do something about it. You know, ironically, Persia was a great civilization with great learning. And they had a postal system that went from one side of the empire to the other. And it was said that the law and order was so intact that a woman could walk from one end of the Persian Empire to the other on the king's roads with jewels on display and not be robbed. You know, but the thing is, it was governed by, you know, kind of god emperors, by you know, kings who said, I'm here because God wants me to be here. It was sort of proto-medievalism. And
okay, that's the popular press. They're just saying they're better than the Assyrians and Babylonians before them, but I don't buy it.
Well, even if it's true, the point is that to the Greeks, that was intolerable, because all of the forms of Greek governance recognized that it was people governing people according to the character of the ruler. And so in Greece, whether you had a democracy or an oligarchy or a tyranny, you wanted to be sure that whoever was at the top was a person of great character. And they didn't hold with this whole, let's not examine the character of the person and just pretend that, you know, the gods appointed them. That was, they saw that as dangerous and leading to corruption, as indeed it did later on. in medievalism. So for them, opposing Persia partially had to do with, we're Greeks and we don't want to be ruled by anybody. And partially it had to do with the form of government that they have is a form of government we can't respect, in which people pretend to be speaking for God. We would rather debate other human beings and decide the right thing to do from there. So I think I'm just adding a little color to what you're saying, but I'm basically agreeing that that was a huge issue for the Greeks. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm almost tempted to ask a question about Thomas Jefferson and the Constitution, but I'll skip that and ask a different question.
Shoot.
It seems like there might be a problem with the dates, though, in terms of the slaves, as Kenneth Smith mentioned, because the anomaly of Spartacus. Spartacus was, I think, from an upper class or maybe even a ruling class who became a slave. And he was treated just as a slave, right?
Yes.
Quite often he won many, many battles before he finally lost.
Yes.
And he wanted to negotiate, and he felt that he should negotiate as an equal, or at least close to an equal. But they always treated him as something else, right?
Right.
But Spartacus was, maybe 60 BC?
That's right.
So that was still at the early stages before Rome was even an empire, it was only a republic.
Well, no, it became an empire much earlier than that.
Okay, but it did become an empire with an emperor and all that.
It did.
So I would imagine that statement about the slaves being classified as a class rather than a character would be, maybe later 300-400 AD. But indeed, if Spartacus took place so early when it was still being reformulated, then was he mistreated? I mean, is that just simply an anomaly because he was not treated through his character, but as a mere slave, we're not going to negotiate with you? Or was it just an exception because he was an enemy and we're not going to take that into account?
Yeah. So that's the thing. The way that the Romans treated Romans versus the way that the Romans treated other subject peoples was often quite different. To be a Roman slave versus to be one of the subject peoples and enslaved was, and you're right, I got my dates wrong, by the way, on Spartacus. You're absolutely right. He was during the Republic. He was before the Empire. Mm-hmm. I was thinking of Masada, which we discussed a few weeks ago. But you're right. So he's Thracian, right? Rather than Roman.
He was a Roman, that's right.
And the Romans, this is where we get into the thing I was talking about with Sharon, is like side by side you have the ideal of the meritocracy, but you don't apply it consistently or evenly. And partially, I stressed it before as being an issue of time and corruption, but it was also, even from the beginning, an issue of, are you one of us or one of them? Because if you're one of them, we'll pretend that you're one of us, but we all know that you're one of them. Okay. And so we'll play these same kind of games about, in theory, you should be able to buy your way out, but in practice, screw you, buddy. It's one of the things that's interesting about the Romans is that they have a problem over quite a long period of time with so much dissembling, not just to each other, but to themselves. It gets tricky to figure out exactly what they're thinking. You're less likely to find anything like a Thucydides saying, I led this battle and I screwed up bad and it hurt. Mm-hmm. You're more likely to find people going, oh, my second in command, he jumped the gun and so I had to kill him. There's a lot of trying to save face from pretty early on among the Romans. And the Romans themselves talk about this. Julius Caesar, Augustus Caesar, some of these very first people are talking about the way there has been a fall. They feel that there has been an ethical fall among the Romans from an earlier taciturn, hardworking farmer soldier stock into corrupt politicians. And when Caesar marches on Rome, when he crosses the river, you know, his justification is that the government has gone corrupt, that it's rotten. And the imposition of the empire is an attempt to force out the corruption through authoritarian means. So some of what you see with something like Spartacus is the Romans betraying their own core values conspicuously, right?
Well, especially if they were going to sort of like use Alexander as a model. I mean, that was a famous thing, which Alexander, having fought a battle, very intense battle with an Indian general, he so admired the Indian general that even though he defeated him, he honored him.
Yes.
Right? Which says you are a man of great character, even though you lost. Right?
Yes.
And which is like, well, we're not going to say that about Spartacus. I mean, which is quite different. I mean, that's not living up to the model of Alexander at all.
That's right. That's right. And this you know, the feeling you're having, if you turn that up to 10, you start to understand why there was a revolution against the ancient epoch and why it was overthrown. Because as those things settled in more, and you know, if it only happens once, you can make an excuse. Oh, it was just that one guy, he wasn't being true. Or if it only happens in certain places, you're like, oh, there's a bad culture over there, that governor, you know, he doesn't lead people well. Or it's just when it keeps happening over and over and over and finally rises to the center of Rome itself, at which point you start getting people saying, well, I know they're corrupt to almost everybody else, but not to me because I'm a Roman.
I need some help, and your sister, I don't know anything about the electrical.
I can't do it right now.
So, you know, there was basically an accumulation of incidents like that and a centralization of the corruption to the point that people couldn't even make excuses anymore. And at that point, there was nothing for it but to overthrow the ancient epoch. So, you know, the example of Spartacus is a good one. And it also underscores how long and slow is the collapse of an epoch, right? The corruption begins manifesting long before it's clear to people that the epoch is going to come apart. Nobody would have thought that what happened with Spartacus was going to lead to the fall of the Roman Empire. I mean, its glory days were still ahead of it as far as it was concerned. But in hindsight, we can see what's happening in Spartacus is the problem on a smaller scale that later would grow to become the large scale feature of the late Roman Empire. Joseph and then Donald and then Ginny. Oh, and by the way, and that's another reason why it's so important for people to be not just specialists, but also generalists, to study lots and lots of things, because you have to cast your net widely to find these incidents like Spartacus that at first seem disconnected, but gradually you can start to piece the pattern together and see how it's part of a larger weave. So go ahead, Joseph.
Yeah, actually, specialization is kind of a form of mental slavery in a way, over specialization anyway. But coming back to that point of mental slavery versus, you know, actual slavery, the physical aspect of it, it seems like people, as you were saying, like they crave almost a mental slavery in a certain way, because there's like an order to it, like whether it be in a religious context or it be in a I don't know, more of a modernistic systematic kind of context. But so what I'm saying is that is even something that people will actually ever embrace, is like this kind of freedom that we're talking about. You know, that this kind of like I don't know, like, will they always be in need of one type of system or the other, like kind of either a religious system or a modernist system, and there's really no in between?
Wow, you know, you're getting at some of the hardest questions.
Can I just interrupt 1 second,
Sure, go ahead, Sharon.
please? For me, mental slavery is pretty simple. I look around in our society today and I see a lot of it. Anybody that believes that JFK is going to come back and be on the ticket with Donald Trump, that's a form of mental slavery. It's total lack of discernment, because discernment is work. I mean, you don't want to do that work, you just believe in anything if it makes you feel good. And there are several rungs going down the ladder from that. So
Sure.
that's my interpretation of it.
Sure, you mean to tell me you don't believe that JFK is going to come back?
Yeah, I'm not sure how much of this has penetrated to other countries, but some of what's going on in the US now has become really batshit crazy. There are people who do believe that JFK is coming back from the dead to run on the ticket in the next presidential election. And when I say some people, I don't mean like 5 people or 10 people. We're talking millions of Americans believe that JFK is going to come back from the dead and run for president or vice president.
Please don't tell me.
Well, if he does, I'm voting for him. I'll tell you
Please
that.
don't tell me people have gotten that crazy. I mean, really,
Yeah,
this is a new one for me.
And they're from Texas. They're from Texas.
Oh,
It's in the
gee.
newspapers. So, you know,
okay.
it's hard to, the feeling, Sharon, that you have when you see that that is happening and you're like, what is wrong with people?
Yes.
That is how the Greeks felt about human nature.
Okay.
Right. I shared that book the other day, you know.
I mean, what food causes people to behave this way? No, I'm just kidding.
Well, the Greeks really
I
wanted
mean,
to
what
know.
are they eating?
The Greeks wrote about this a lot. They were really frustrated with human beings for being so. And they, in the modern world, what we say is it's those other people who are stupid.
No, it's not.
But what the Greeks said is it's us, right? We're a species. We together, the best and the brightest, trying as hard as we are nevertheless disturbingly stupid. And it's really frustrating because we can so cleanly imagine what we would be like if we were smarter. If we could remember from one day to the next what we'd been planning to do, you know, if we could come to a decision as a group and actually do that thing instead of the very next day, half of us have forgotten we ever agreed in the first place. It's like that issue. The Greeks wrote about that as often as they wrote about the problem of mortality. They said, you know, it would be a curse to make human beings immortal if you didn't also cure their stupidity. Because the only thing worse than this state of affairs would be to be stupid for all eternity. The Greeks said, we're not having that. They said, unless we can also be given the gift of intelligence, we don't want immortality. That would be horrible, because you would be incurring the consequences of your bad decisions forever, not just for a few decades. Like, it would be thousands of years later and still some stupid thing you said when you were 15 would be haunting you and getting in your way. And, you know, there'd be a whole movement of people who believed that thing that you now disagreed with, and you were fighting your own words. They're like, they could.
But then to a certain degree, we are still living in eternity, so to speak, because we really have not changed from a couple of thousand years ago. Right. So it may not be one person living forever, but in terms of human species having committed this stupidity throughout centuries and thousands of years, so we are sort of living in eternal stupidity, so to speak. Do you hear what I'm saying? I mean,
I do.
Yeah.
You know, and it's why Heraclitus said, you know, of all of the virtues, wisdom stands apart from all else. Before we get any other virtues that are good things that we might want, we really should get wiser than we are now, because we're our own worst enemies. Donald and then Ginny.
It seems to me that we've got ourselves into quite a bind here.
Yes.
If civilization depends largely on education, in our modernity, and we had our language, our Quechuan language with its evidentiality, it would make it perfectly clear that everyone's mostly appealing to authority.
Right.
Because so much of the knowledge in modern science and technology, the observations necessary to use anything other than somebody told me,
yes,
only exist for very few. I mean, you know, you can say, like, I mean, take anything, you know, if you're trying to, yes, I know general relativity is largely true. I lack totally the means for ever making any of the observations that support that.
yes,
You know, beyond some simple logic and mathematics, it would all be, I heard it somewhere. And
yes,
and quite frankly, you know, we've talked about the sort of the republic might be a reductio ad absurdum. Well, if we in the United States are going to teach 300 and something million people to easily read Greek and Latin, to go through the ancient corpus on a regular basis, like somebody like Gilbert Murray did, you know, I think it was said that every 2 years he read everything that still existed in those languages.
yes,
Just to keep his hand in, you know.
yes.
Well, did he read more than Rick Marshall did then?
Oh, yes, so much more.
Gilbert,
He was brilliant.
you know, I've mentioned this before. I have a collection. So I have some early books, you know, from classicists of either the 19th century or whatever, where it's assumed that the reader can read English, French, German, Greek, and Latin, and
Yes.
translations are only provided for some other language.
Right.
You know,
Right.
that a reasonably educated person might
Should
not
all
know.
of that.
You know?
Yeah. They just assume that you know all that.
Yeah, yeah. And that you've read, not as part of your college education, but you would have learned these languages in your primary and secondary education. That is, high school graduates,
Yes.
of course, there were few, would have known Greek and Latin for sure. So I don't know. I don't know if this is a hopeful thing or a not a hopeful, not hopeful at all, because, you know, even in terms of what we think of historical knowledge, if we really traced it, no one alive saw any of these things.
Right.
We'd have to put them down as hearsay.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'm beginning to think nobody knows anything except I will say that as long as there's that, you know, payday loan store on the corner near here, that slavery is real.
Yes.
Or slavish personalities are real. The character analysis that shows that some people can't rule their own lives is the evidence for that is pretty clear. Well, enough. I'll go back to sleep.
Thank you, Donald. Excellent as usual. Yeah, it can be disturbing for a modern reader to read some of those 19th century classical works and find foreign language after foreign language interspersed in the middle of English with no translation, no footnotes. You're just expected to recognize, not only to be able to read it, but to recognize where it came from.
Yeah. They don't even cite where it came from. One of the things that's kind of interesting along this lines in Plato is he often quotes Homer or Hesiod, and he quotes often. I used to have examples, but my mind doesn't have any right now, of where he quotes the first line, which seems irrelevant to what's happening in the dialogue.
Yes.
Because it's the second half of the line or the line following or preceding that's important. And Plato is confident that the Athenian reader knows from memory Homer.
Right.
And says, oh, that's funny, because he's really aiming at the other line. You know?
Right. He knows they've read it.
He can assume they've all read and know from memory Homer and Hesiod. So
yes,
we're not. Gosh, we want to improve the quality of our civilization. It's looking tough. Looking like it's going to be an uphill.
Well, the other way to put that is it would be incredibly easy to improve the level of education. Because we got plenty of room to go. We have not
and we have to
our limits at all.
And Donald, I mean, we do have to think about the fact that at that time, they didn't have nearly as many books to read. I mean, the Iliad and the Odyssey probably was one of very few stories that they were able to read. So, I mean, there's just so many to choose from now to read. So it's quite understandable that they would know whatever stories that are in existence at that time, probably.
Well, and of course,
and like when people went to see Greek tragedies, for example, in these theaters, apparently they knew all the stories that were written at the plays that were written at the time. They knew the story for many, many years, and they just wanted to see what Sophocles did what rendition that he placed on that particular story that they all knew.
I think you're exactly right on that, Jenny. And it took me decades to get to the understanding of why the Greeks kept retelling these stories, only with a slight change. It was, you know,
they came to see what Sophocles did, what Aeschylus did to the story, or, you know, Euripides or whatever.
You know, because I used to think, well, and then I realized, we do this. Why do we remake certain movies?
Right.
You know, why do directors of plays set them and have them have the same text done differently or something? But it takes an audience also that sort of knows the canonical version.
Yes.
And then is understanding how it's being changed and for what purpose it might be being changed in this case.
Right.
My question to you, Rick, that's why I raised my hand, is going back to what you said many minutes ago. You were talking about not Antony and Cleopatra, Julius Caesar, Shakespeare's Julius Caesar.
Yeah.
And I've been thinking all along now of how much Shakespeare might have read about Julius Caesar when he wrote the play. You know, how much material was available for him to read, you know, before he wrote these plays. I mean, I can understand he may have known quite a bit about English, like, you know, Henry V or whatever, the plays that he's written, historical plays that he's written about English kings and whatever. But I'm just wondering in terms of like Julius Caesar, I'm just wondering how much he knew from having read and researched before he wrote these plays.
He had two main sources. He sourced off of a lot of places, but he had two main sources. One of them was Holinshed's Chronicles, and the other one was, I think, a Roman writer whose name is escaping me right now, and I'm ashamed because normally it's on the tip of my tongue. But there was a Roman writer who wrote a great deal about the Greeks and the Romans, and he mined those for stories over and over and over. They've traced a lot of his plays back to one or the other, or in some cases both.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
So yeah, he had his sources, but but it's exactly the case you're talking about, Ginny, right? People would go to see Shakespeare because the question isn't, tell me the story of Macbeth I've never heard before. It's like, well, what does Shakespeare have to say about Macbeth? They've all heard the story, but never like the way he was telling it, and he would, like the previous great dramaticians before him, he would draw out nuances of character and nature that other people had missed in telling the story and make it all new again. Yeah, it's powerful. And, I suppose Kenneth would argue that that sort of thing, something related to that, is part of the duty of an Aristos, that your job is culture creation by going back to the core stories of the civilization and juicing them for more meaning to help bind us together and aim us better than we were before. Phil, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just sort of so taken by the comment about being stupid forever.
Yes.
I mean, it really sheds a new light on Heidegger's horizon of temporality. I'll just say that. And my comment about that is that, often when I drive in the freeway,
yes,
I would say to myself, if I only live here, I would be home by now.
Yes.
So that's a grace of temporality that we could never reach in Los Angeles. Not that I'm in Los Angeles.
Yeah, I've shared this before, but I'll share it again, and I'm sharing it again now, which is Emily Vermeule, Aspects of Death in Early Greek Art and Poetry. Oh my God, what a revelation. So much wisdom she's finding was written in old poems or painted onto vases that we associate with later writers. We think later writers invented these ideas, but here are these old Greek artists, and they've already got those ideas centuries before. And they're the ones who are saying, oh, the triple cross that we are trapped upon, that we die, we live for such a short time, that our creative works last for such a short time, and that we're so stupid. That is, to be mortal is to suffer those three things, any one of which by itself would be horrible enough. But you put the three together, and we have the great struggles of the human condition that the Greeks were desperate to try to find some way to overcome in some way, in some fashion. And it takes us back to Heraclitus when he says, the great problem of human beings is that they want the wrong things. They should want to be wiser, but instead they want anything but that, which means, people are longing for immortal life, not understanding that means they'll be stupid forever. It's like there is all of this stuff, the great horrific tragedies that should be foremost in our minds. Somehow we just lose track of them. It's like, oh, that lollipop over there suddenly is driven out of my mind all of the most important things I was going to do today. I think I'll lick this thing instead. It's like
well, maybe there is a magic number. Maybe if a human beings could live to be 300 or more, maybe all of a sudden we become wise. Who knows? We would never know that,
Yeah, it's something.
We would have to stop the shortening of the telomeres. That's what determines our age, and we can't do that. So we're going.
Yeah, it would be lovely if age automatically brought wisdom, but I mean, even the ancient Greeks knew that wasn't true.
Correct.
Plenty of people instead they become self-caricatures. They compound their errors.
Yeah.
They deny their mistakes and scapegoat everybody else. It's part of the reason why you get a certain generation of angry old men who blame the young, they blame foreigners, they blame women, they blame everybody but themselves, because they can't bear to take responsibility for the parts of their life that they themselves have screwed up. And, I sympathize. It would be bad enough if all we had to contend with were bad things outside of ourselves, the way so many people seem to think. But alas, we carry plenty of bad things inside ourselves and set them in motion with poor decision making. So,
well, this is the Asian tradition where, my life started in South Korea at a young age, and it was all about, respect the elderly. Elderly are wise. Respect the elderly. So that's the way I grew up for the longest time. Oh yes, old people are wise, so you need to listen to them. They're wise. And then all of a sudden I realized, oh, no, they're not, are they really? I mean, and all of a sudden they have dementia and not only are they not wise, but they start regressing backwards to.
So you got to get them before they become demented because they are wise.
Yeah.
You gotta get the wisdom before the dementia sets in, Jay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a common thing in indigenous culture that you have to cherish the elders, and
Yes.
Because maybe they're foolish, but so are you, and they've seen more than you have. So whatever wisdom has been available in that time, you have a better chance of getting it from them than out of yourself because you're so much younger than they are.
Correct.
So, it's one understands the value system. So next week we'll pick up right where we left off, and we're going to start by talking about Black Hawk, and we'll also talk about Demetrius of Phalaris, and we'll talk about Polybius. He doesn't cite. If you look at this, you would think that he doesn't cite Polybius, but the truth is that quotation of Demetrius of Phalaris is only preserved in Polybius. We wouldn't have it at all.
Polybius?
Yeah, Polybius.
Okay, so I could look him up.
Yeah, he's the work in particular. It's in here. Blah 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 blah. Here it is. Polybius, The Histories, Volume 6. And the reason that this matters is that this quote by Demetrius of Phalaris is talking about how after conquering the Greeks, the Macedonians then conquered Persia so completely there was no Persia ever again. There was no Persian Empire until the end of time after that. And nobody, not even the Macedonians a generation before, would have imagined how could that happen.
Yeah.
And Demetrius is talking about that. But Polybius is quoting Demetrius because he's delivering an oration after the Romans have conquered Macedonia, which has now been wiped off the map and is gone for all time, and there will never be another Macedonian empire. And they're talking about the nature of fortune and history and the creative works of man, which takes us back to Emily Vermeule's aspects of death. This is why all these things come together. We're talking, it's one of the few quotes that really seriously straddles centuries and talks about the way that epochs turn over. So we'll begin with Black Hawk, and then we'll.
I still have my issue, the definition of rationalism, because I keep on hearing people define the rational as reason, which is really just a tautology. And I hear this word bandied around all the time, and I've given it a lot of thought. And I cannot understand why all these rationalists don't even bother to define their own term.
Well, in fact, it's not an accident. If they were to carefully define their term, it would lose its authority over them, and they can't stand that, so they won't define it. It's going to come up over and over in this book. It's part of the reason I'm not directly addressing the question yet. Is we're going to get one set of answers by going through the ancient epoch. We're going to get another set of answers by going through the medieval. We'll get a third set by going through the modern, and then we can decide for ourselves. What do we think about these different perspectives on what rationality and reason are? It's going to be a great discussion.
Because it's part of it. I finished it. I wrote it up this week, and it also has to do with logic. The definition of rationality includes reason and logic, but we can't go into that now. We're near the end.
Yeah, because we're out of time for today. But
yes.
But yeah, we'll pick up right here next week.
All right. Well,
okay.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Rick, as always.
I'll try to get the right text
Thank you,
next time.
Good luck, Phil.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Have a great week.
Thank you, Rick.
Thank you for all the work you do.